Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The notification popped up on my phone during my lunch break at the marketing firm, where I'd been working since college graduation. My roommate from those days, Natalie, had posted another photo from her solo hiking trip in the Sierra Nevada, something she'd been planning since her messy divorce finalized in February. The picture showed her grinning at a mountain vista, backpack straps digging into her shoulders, her red bandana soaked with sweat. I double-tapped it without really looking, the way you do when you're scrolling mindlessly through a sandwich. But then my coworker Jenna leaned over my shoulder and asked who that guy was in the background, way back among the pine trees. I zoomed in and felt my appetite disappear. There was definitely someone there, just a dark shape between the trunks, maybe 60 feet behind where Natalie had set up her timer. The worst part was that Natalie had no idea anyone was there. Her caption just said something about finally finding peace after all the chaos. I immediately went back through her previous posts from the trip. She'd been documenting everything for the past 3 days, posting every few hours whenever she got signal. Sunrise shots, trail markers, her battered hiking boots next to streams. My 30th birthday was coming up next month, and Natalie had promised to be back in time for it. But now I was wondering if she'd make it back at all. The figure first appeared in a photo from yesterday morning. So far away you'd think it was just shadows playing tricks. But in each subsequent photo, that same dark shape got progressively closer. In her lunch photo from yesterday, you could make out that it was definitely a person in what looked like a brown jacket. In last night's sunset photo at her campsite, the person stood maybe 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a boulder. The most recent photo, posted just 2 hours ago, showed Natalie filtering water at a creek, and the man, because you could tell it was a man now, stood clear as day about 20 feet behind her, just watching. He wore regular street clothes, not hiking gear, and his face was turned away from the camera. But something about his posture made every hair on my neck stand up. The comments section under her posts had already started buzzing. People were asking about the photo bomber and whether she was hiking with someone, but Natalie hadn't responded to any of them, which was weird because she usually replied to everything within minutes when she had signal. I tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Then I tried messaging her through every app we had in common, Instagram, WhatsApp, even that stupid word game we'd been playing for years. Nothing. The last time she'd been online was 2 hours ago, right when she posted that water filtering photo. I started typing a comment under her post, deleted it, typed again. How do you tell someone there's a stranger stalking them without sounding completely paranoid? Finally, I just wrote, "Call me immediately when you see this," in all caps, and hit send. Jenna had gathered a small crowd around my desk by then, everyone squinting at my phone screen and arguing about whether we were overreacting. Our manager, Bradley, said it was probably just another hiker who happened to be on the same trail, that the Sierra Nevada routes were popular this time of year. But then our intern pulled up Natalie's Instagram on his laptop and projected it onto the conference room screen. When you saw all the photos laid out in a grid, the pattern was undeniable. The man appeared in 7 consecutive photos over 2 days, getting closer each time, always maintaining that same unnatural stillness while Natalie moved around doing normal hiking activities. In one photo where she was cooking dinner at her campsite, he stood just outside the circle of light from her camping stove, barely visible except for the reflection on what looked like glasses. Nobody takes the exact same route at the exact same pace for 2 days straight by coincidence. Bradley wanted us to get back to work, said we were making a mountain out of nothing, but I couldn't focus on spreadsheets while my best friend might be in danger. I pulled up the Park Service website and found the emergency contact number for the Sierra Nevada district where Natalie was hiking. The ranger who answered sounded bored until I explained the situation. Then his voice changed completely. He asked for Natalie's full name, her planned route, and the GPS coordinates from her photos. Thank God she always tagged her locations. He said they'd been getting reports about someone matching that description, a man in brown clothing who'd been spotted near several solo female hikers' campsites over the past week. 2 women had reported items missing from their tents. Nothing valuable, just personal things like hairbrushes and worn socks. The ranger took down my information and said they'd send someone to check Natalie's last known location immediately. The waiting was unbearable. I stayed at my desk long after everyone else went home, refreshing Natalie's social media every few seconds and checking my phone for any response to my messages. Around 7 that evening, her Instagram account showed she was typing. Those 3 dots appeared and my heart jumped. But then they disappeared. Appeared again. Disappeared. This went on for almost 10 minutes, like someone was starting to type and then deleting it over and over. I screenshot everything and sent it to the ranger's email, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. At 7:23, she posted a new photo, but it wasn't really a photo, just a black screen. The caption only had her location tag, some coordinates deep in the wilderness, and nothing else. The comments exploded immediately with people asking if she was okay, if her phone was broken, what was happening. Then at 7:31, a 10-second video appeared on her story. The camera was pointed at the ground, showing pine needles and dirt, and you could hear heavy breathing, not like someone exhausted from hiking, but ragged, panicked breathing. Right before the video cut off, there was a man's voice, very calm and quiet, saying something that sounded like, "Not yet." I called 911 immediately, my voice cracking as I tried to explain everything to the dispatcher. She transferred me to search and rescue, where I had to tell the whole story again while sending them all the screenshots I'd saved. The coordinator said they were mobilizing a team, but it would take at least 2 hours to reach Natalie's last coordinates. The terrain was rough and the nearest access road was miles away. 2 hours felt like a lifetime. I called Natalie's sister in Colorado, woke her up and tried to explain without completely terrifying her. She said she'd drive to the airport immediately and catch the first flight out. Then I did something stupid. I posted in a massive hiking forum asking if anyone was near those coordinates, if anyone could help. Within minutes, 3 different hikers responded saying they were within 10 miles and would head toward her location. One of them, username Colorado Trail Dog, said he'd seen a man matching the description earlier that day, walking without any gear except a small backpack, no water bottles, no hiking poles, nothing you'd need for a multi-day trek. The Instagram story disappeared after an hour, the way they do, but her account stayed active, that green dot showing she was online. Every 20 minutes or so, another black photo would appear and then get deleted within seconds. Some had partial captions like "he says" or "still here," or just random letters like she was trying to type without looking. Colorado Trail Dog kept updating the forum thread, said he'd reached the general area and was calling out for Natalie but getting no response. He found fresh boot prints, 2 sets, one definitely smaller than the other, leading off the main trail into a dense section of forest. The Park Service told him to wait for the official team, not to follow the tracks alone, but he said he could hear something that might be voices further in the woods. His last update was at 9:47. Following the sound, phone at 8% battery, will update when I can. Then nothing. The search and rescue coordinator called me directly, his professional calm barely covering real concern. They'd found Colorado Trail Dog's abandoned backpack at the tree line, his phone dead on the ground next to it. The screen cracked like it had been stepped on. By midnight, the search and rescue team had set up a base camp near Natalie's last known coordinates. The lead ranger kept me on speakerphone as they worked, probably because I'd threatened to drive up there myself if they didn't keep me informed. They'd brought thermal imaging drones and search dogs, the whole production. Around 1 a.m., one of the dogs picked up a scent and led them through thick undergrowth to a small clearing. Natalie's tent was still standing, perfectly set up like she'd just stepped out for a minute. Her sleeping bag was unrolled inside, her camp stove sitting on a flat rock with a half-eaten packet of freeze-dried mac and cheese next to it. But Natalie wasn't there. Her backpack was gone, but weirdly her hiking boots were placed neatly outside the tent, toes pointing toward the woods. The search team found her phone about 30 feet from the tent, propped against a tree stump. It was still recording video, had been for 8 hours straight according to the file size, just filming the dark forest. The battery was almost dead, running on 2%. The ranger described everything to me as they processed the scene, and one detail made my whole body go cold. There were fingernail marks on several trees around the campsite, fresh scratches in the bark like someone had been dragged past them, trying to grab hold. The drone picked up 2 heat signatures about a quarter-mile north, moving slowly through difficult terrain. The team immediately headed that direction, but when they got close, the heat signatures separated. One stopped completely while the other moved rapidly away, too fast for someone carrying gear through the wilderness at night. They found Natalie sitting on a fallen log, barefoot, staring straight ahead. She was wearing different clothes than in her last photos. A man's oversized brown jacket over her hiking outfit. When the rangers approached, she didn't respond to her name at first, just kept mumbling numbers over and over. 873-294, 873-294. They wrapped her in emergency blankets and carried her to the helicopter that had just arrived. She was physically unharmed except for scratches on her feet and hands, but she wouldn't stop repeating those numbers or explain what had happened. I drove through the night to reach the hospital in Fresno, where they'd taken her. When I finally got to see her the next afternoon, Natalie was awake, but different. She'd answer simple questions, but would go silent whenever anyone asked about those missing hours. The police interviewed her multiple times, and she'd just stare at her bandaged hands and whisper those same numbers. A detective told me they'd run the numbers through every database they could think of. Coordinates, phone numbers, social security, license plates, but found nothing. The brown jacket she'd been wearing had no labels, no identifying marks, just smelled strongly of wood smoke and something chemical they couldn't identify. 3 days later, Colorado trail dog, real name Gary Brennan, walked out of the forest on his own, dehydrated and confused. He had no memory of anything after posting that last forum update, just woke up leaning against a tree with his shoes on the wrong feet and his backpack missing. The medical examination found a small injection mark on his neck, likely from some kind of sedative, but the toxicology results were inconclusive. They never found the man from the photos. The 8-hour video from Natalie's phone showed only darkness and trees, but the audio picked up footsteps circling the area for the first 3 hours, then nothing but forest sounds. At exactly 4:23:16 in the recording, there's a whisper that sounds like 873-294 repeated once, but the voice is too distorted to determine if it's male or female. Natalie stayed with her sister for 2 months after leaving the hospital, slowly returning to herself, though she never went hiking again and deleted all her social media accounts. She finally told me, 6 months later over coffee, that she remembered fragments. The man had never spoken to her directly, just walked behind her for 2 days, getting closer. When he finally approached her at the campsite, he'd sat across from her and pulled out a notebook filled with hundreds of photos of different women on hiking trails, all taken from behind, all at varying distances. He'd pointed to a blank page and then at her, like he was showing her where she fit in his collection. The numbers she kept repeating, she'd seen them written on the back of one photo that had fallen out. A woman who looked just like her, same red bandana, same build, standing at what appeared to be the same creek where Natalie had filtered water. The photo was dated from exactly 1 year before. October 2018 was supposed to be just another camping trip with my college buddies. I'd been managing a sporting goods store in Durango for about 2 years by then, right after my 26th birthday, while finishing up my accounting degree online. My roommate Kyle worked at the same store, and we'd been planning this hike for months with 3 other friends. Jason, who taught middle school science, his girlfriend Megan, who worked as a veterinary technician, and our buddy Christopher, who'd just gotten back from a year teaching English in Japan. We picked that specific weekend because the trails would be less crowded and the aspen trees would be turning gold throughout the San Juan Mountains. The weather forecast showed clear skies for 3 straight days, perfect conditions for what we thought would be a straightforward camping trip through some of the most beautiful backcountry in the state. We started our hike on a Friday morning from the Cunningham Gulch trailhead, each of us carrying about 35 pounds of gear, including our winter-rated sleeping bags, since temperatures could drop below freezing at night, even in early fall. The plan was to follow the Continental Divide Trail for about 8 miles before setting up our first camp near Highland Mary Lakes. Around noon, we stopped for lunch where the trail split near a weathered wooden sign. The main path continued upward toward the lakes, but there was another trail branching off to the left, blocked by a rusted chain strung between 2 posts and a faded Forest Service sign that read, "Trail closed, hazardous conditions." Jason pulled out his GPS device and showed us that this closed trail would actually cut about 3 miles off our route, connecting back to the Continental Divide Trail further up. The path looked clear enough from where we stood, just slightly overgrown with some loose scree visible in the distance. Megan voiced what we were all thinking about taking the closed trail, saying it seemed like overkill to add 3 extra miles when the path appeared mostly intact. Christopher examined the sign more closely and noticed the date stamp was from 2015, suggesting whatever rock slide had closed it might have stabilized by now. Kyle was already unhooking the chain, arguing that the Forest Service probably just hadn't gotten around to reassessing the trail yet. The thing that convinced me was how many other boot prints we could see in the dirt beyond the chain. Clearly, we wouldn't be the first people to ignore the closure. We ducked under the barrier one by one, Jason making some joke about how his students would never let him live it down if they knew their science teacher was ignoring safety warnings. The trail started fine, maybe a bit narrower than the main path, winding through a grove of aspens whose golden leaves created a tunnel of light that made everything feel almost dreamlike. About an hour into the closed trail, the landscape began to change in subtle ways that none of us commented on at first. The aspens gave way to twisted pine trees that grew at odd angles, their trunks bent and gnarled like they'd been fighting against hurricane winds their whole lives. The bird sounds that had been constant all morning gradually faded, until all we could hear was our own breathing and the crunch of gravel under our boots. Christopher kept checking his phone even though we all knew there was no signal out here, and Megan moved closer to Jason, linking her arm through his without saying why. The trail itself remained clear enough to follow, but the rock formations on either side started to feel oppressive. These massive granite walls streaked with what looked like burn marks, even though there hadn't been any forest fires in this area recently, according to the ranger station website I'd checked before we left. We found the first boot around 3 in the afternoon, just sitting there in the middle of the trail like someone had carefully placed it as a marker. It was a newer hiking boot, probably expensive based on the brand, size 11 or 12, with the laces still tied in a perfect bow. Kyle picked it up and examined it, turning it over to show us that the sole was barely worn, maybe only used for a few hikes. No foot inside, no blood, no signs of violence, just an abandoned boot that had no business being there. Jason suggested maybe someone had broken a lace and decided to leave it behind, but that didn't explain why they'd leave the entire boot, or why it looked so deliberately positioned. We spent maybe 10 minutes searching the surrounding area for its pair or any other gear, but found nothing except some weird scratches on the nearby rocks. These deep parallel grooves that ran vertically up the stone face for about 15 feet before just stopping. The second strange discovery came about 20 minutes later, when the trail opened into a small clearing where someone had set up camp recently. Very recently based on how fresh everything looked. 3 tents were still standing, but every single one had been slashed open from top to bottom, the cuts so clean and straight, they looked almost surgical. Sleeping bags were laid out inside each tent, completely zipped up and arranged as if people were still in them. But when Kyle nudged one with his trekking pole, it was obviously empty. The fire pit in the center had logs arranged for burning, but they'd never been lit, and there were 5 camp chairs set up in a perfect circle around it. What really made my chest tighten was the cooler we found tucked behind one of the tents, still full of ice, with sandwiches wrapped in plastic that couldn't have been more than a day old, based on how fresh the bread looked. Christopher started taking photos with his phone while Megan kept asking who would leave all this expensive gear behind. Easily $2,000 worth of equipment just abandoned. Jason found the journal tucked into one of the tent pockets, a small waterproof notebook with entries dating back 3 days. The handwriting started neat and organized, detailing a group's plan to explore some caves they'd heard about from locals in Silverton. But the last entry from that morning was barely legible. Just the same phrase written over and over again, covering 2 full pages. They walk between the spaces. Kyle grabbed the journal from Jason and flipped through it himself, his face going pale when he reached the final pages where someone had drawn crude figures. Dozens of stick people with too many joints in their arms and legs, all surrounding what looked like a tent. We should have left then, should have turned around and hiked back the way we came. But Jason convinced us we were only about 2 miles from where the trail reconnected with the main path according to his GPS, and none of us wanted to admit how scared we were getting. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountain peaks when we heard the first whistle, this long, clear note that seemed to come from somewhere above us on the ridge. We all stopped walking at the same time, looking up at the rocky cliffsides trying to spot another hiker, thinking maybe the people from the abandoned camp were somewhere nearby. Then came an answering whistle from the opposite side of the canyon, identical in pitch and length, followed by a third from somewhere behind us on the trail we'd just traveled. Kyle shouted out a greeting, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, asking if anyone needed help. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath, and then all 3 whistles repeated simultaneously, except this time, they were noticeably closer. Christopher pulled out his phone to record the sound, but the battery died instantly, even though he swore it had been at 60% just minutes before. We decided to set up camp right there instead of pushing forward in the growing darkness, choosing a spot with our backs against a solid rock wall so nothing could approach from behind. Our hands fumbled with the tent poles and stakes, everyone trying to work faster as the temperature dropped and those whistles continued every few minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always from multiple directions like we were being triangulated. Jason kept insisting it had to be other hikers playing some kind of prank. Maybe the people from the abandoned camp trying to scare others away from their gear so they could come back for it later. But when Megan pointed out that no one could move that quickly between those positions on such rough terrain, he didn't have an answer. We skipped dinner entirely, just crawled into our tents as soon as they were up, though none of us actually changed out of our hiking clothes or even took off our boots. I shared a tent with Kyle, and we lay there in our sleeping bags listening to the sounds outside gradually change as full darkness set in. The whistles had stopped about an hour after we made camp, replaced by something worse, footsteps circling our tents in a slow, measured pace. Not the random movement of an animal, but deliberate steps that would pause directly outside the tent wall, so close we could hear breathing that sounded wrong somehow, too deep and lasting too long, like whoever was out there had lungs twice the size of a normal person. Kyle gripped his knife so tight I could hear the leather handle creaking, and I had my hand on the bear spray, though we both knew that wouldn't help if a person really wanted to hurt us. Around midnight, Megan started crying in the tent next to ours, these quiet, muffled sobs while Jason whispered to her that everything would be okay, that we'd hike out first thing in the morning and report all of this to the rangers. Then Christopher's voice came from his solo tent, high and stretched thin with panic, saying someone was pressing against his tent wall, that he could see the outline of hands pushing in against the fabric. The next part happened so fast that even now, sitting here typing this out, I struggle to put the sequence of events in the right order. There was a sound like fabric tearing, but amplified, like someone had put a microphone next to ripping canvas, and Christopher just started screaming, Not words, but this raw, primal sound I'd never heard a human make before. Kyle and I burst out of our tent at the same time Jason emerged from his, all of us holding our phones with the flashlight function on, the beams swinging wildly through the darkness. Christopher's tent was still standing, but he was gone. Just gone, with a vertical slit down the side exactly like the ones we'd seen at the abandoned camp. His sleeping bag was still zipped up inside, his backpack untouched. But in the dirt outside the tear we could see drag marks leading away into the darkness, along with those same boot prints he'd been wearing. Except between each footprint there were these other impressions, like someone had been walking on their knuckles alongside him, keeping pace. Jason wanted to follow the tracks immediately, but Megan became hysterical, grabbing his arm and screaming that we needed to leave now, that we needed to run back down the trail in the dark rather than wait for whatever took Christopher to come back. While they argued, Kyle and I stood there with our lights pointed at the darkness where the tracks disappeared, and that's when we saw them, eyes reflecting our lights from at least a dozen different positions among the rocks and trees, all at different heights, like some were crouching and others were standing on elevated positions. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us as we slowly backed toward our tents to grab our packs. We didn't even stuff our sleeping bags, just shoved whatever we could into our backpacks in seconds and started running down the trail in the opposite direction from those eyes, Megan's sobbing echoing off the canyon walls as we stumbled through the darkness with only our phone lights to guide us. Though mine died completely, about 10 minutes into our desperate escape. What followed was 3 hours of pure terror that I can only remember in fragments, like my brain refused to properly record what was happening. We ran until our legs gave out, then walked, then ran again whenever we heard those whistles starting up behind us, always maintaining that same triangulated pattern but getting closer each time. At some point, Kyle just vanished. 1 second he was right beside me. The next there was nothing but empty trail, and his phone lying cracked on the ground, still showing the flashlight screen. I picked it up and kept moving because stopping meant joining him in whatever had happened. Jason and Megan were somewhere ahead of me, but their voices grew fainter until I couldn't hear them at all. Just my own ragged breathing and the sound of pursuit that never quite caught up, but never fell behind either. The trail split and merged and split again. Or maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion and dehydration. But I kept moving through brush that tore at my clothes and rocks that shredded my hands when I fell, which was often. Dawn found me stumbling along a service road I didn't recognize. My boots gone, though I don't remember taking them off or losing them, my feet bleeding and swollen from walking on rocks and gravel. A park maintenance crew found me sitting in the middle of the road, unable to tell them anything coherent except that we weren't alone out there, which I must have repeated dozens of times based on what the rescue coordinator told me later. They searched for 72 straight hours using helicopters, dogs, and volunteer teams, eventually finding our abandoned campsite and the tracks that led to a cliff edge where everything just stopped. All the boot prints, the drag marks, even those strange knuckle impressions just ended at a sheer drop with no bodies below. No equipment. Nothing. The official report lists them all as missing, presumed dead from a fall, but they never found any remains, and the investigators couldn't explain the abandoned camp we'd found, or why my friend's tracks seemed to show them walking calmly to the cliff edge, in a perfect single-file line based on the spacing, not running or struggling, but walking with measured, identical steps, like they were following something that left no tracks of its own. The Cascade Range has always been my escape from the chaos of Seattle. Every summer since college, those mountains called to me like an old friend, and this particular June in 2022 was no different. The guided trek advertised on the outdoor recreation board at REI seemed perfect. 3 days through lesser-known trails with a small group, led by someone who knew every rock and route along the path. 8 strangers total, including myself and the guide, all seeking something in those ancient peaks. Born in 1990, the same year Mount Redoubt erupted in Alaska, My mother always joked that mountains were in my blood from day one. What none of us knew was that we'd become one of those stories other hikers whisper about around campfires, the kind that makes people check their GPS twice and stay closer to established trails. My alarm went off at 4 in the morning that Tuesday, and by 5:30, I was pulling into the gravel parking area near Snoqualmie Pass, where we'd all agreed to meet before carpooling to the actual trailhead. The guide, a woman named Diane with silver streaks through her braided hair and laugh lines that suggested years of mountain sunshine, was already there, organizing gear in the back of her Subaru Outback. 2 other cars sat nearby, a dusty blue pickup with Idaho plates and a newer Toyota 4Runner that still had the dealership frame. The morning air carried that specific Pacific Northwest chill that promises heat later but demands layers now, and I remember zipping my fleece up to my chin while making awkward small talk with the others as they arrived. By 6:15, our complete group had assembled. Besides Diane and myself, there was a couple from Portland celebrating their 10th anniversary, 2 college buddies from Tacoma who kept making inside jokes about their fraternity days, a solo hiker named Walter who barely spoke above a whisper, and a woman around my age named Grace who worked as a nurse at Harborview Medical Center. We transferred our gear into 2 vehicles, Diane's Subaru and the 4Runner, which belonged to one of the Tacoma guys, and began the hour-long drive to the actual trailhead. The whole way there, Diane talked about the route, how we'd be following an old Forest Service trail that connected to a series of alpine lakes, most of which didn't even have official names, just numbers assigned by long-dead surveyors. The trailhead parking area was nothing more than a widened shoulder along a Forest Service road, marked only by a wooden post with the number 12 carved deep into the weathered grain. That marker would haunt me for months afterward, appearing in dreams where the numbers seemed to bleed sap like an open wound. Diane distributed the group gear among us: water purification tablets, first aid supplies, emergency beacons that she assured us we wouldn't need, but protocol demanded. The morning had warmed considerably by then, steam rising from the damp earth where sunshine broke through the canopy, and everything smelled like pine resin and moss. We signed the trail register attached to the post, each of us printing our names and emergency contacts in the rain-spotted notebook, never imagining those would be the last words some of us would ever write. The first few miles were exactly what you'd expect from a Cascade trail in early summer. Switchbacks through Douglas firs, occasional glimpses of snow-capped peaks through breaks in the trees, and the constant sound of water running somewhere just out of sight. Grace walked beside me for a while, talking about her shifts in the emergency room, how hiking helped her decompress from seeing humanity at its worst. The Portland couple, who introduced themselves as Tom and Heather, took photos at every scenic spot, their matching hiking boots and coordinated outdoor gear making them look like a REI catalog spread. But it was Walter who caught my attention most. He kept stopping every few hundred yards, not to catch his breath or admire the view, but to stare back down the trail we just climbed, his head tilted like he was listening for something specific. Around noon, we reached a small clearing where Diane suggested we break for lunch. The Tacoma guys, Aaron and Josh, had brought a portable speaker and started playing classic rock, which earned them a gentle but firm talking to from Diane about respecting the wilderness experience. While we ate our trail mix and sandwiches, Diane pulled out a laminated map and showed us our route. We'd camp tonight near the first alpine lake, tomorrow night at a higher elevation near a ridge she called the Sidewalk because of how flat and narrow it was, then loop back to the cars on day 3. She pointed to various landmarks, her finger tracing the dotted line of our path, but when she got to explaining the section after mile marker 12, her voice changed slightly, became more businesslike, almost rehearsed. "This part can be tricky," she said, tapping the map, "so we'll need to stay close together tomorrow morning." The afternoon hike grew progressively stranger, though nothing I could specifically point to as wrong. The forest seemed to swallow sound in odd ways. Aaron would be talking loudly just ahead of me, then his voice would cut out completely for a second before returning, like someone had briefly muted the world. Birds called from the canopy but never showed themselves, and twice I could have sworn I heard footsteps matching ours from somewhere off trail. That peculiar rhythm of boots on earth that's unmistakable once you know it. When I mentioned it to Grace, she nodded slowly and admitted she'd been hearing it too. But when we told Diane, she just smiled and said the forest plays tricks. That sound bounces weird off the valley walls. Her explanation made perfect sense, but the way Walter immediately stepped closer to our group when she said it suggested he wasn't buying it either. We reached the first lake just before 5 that evening. A pristine circle of blue-green water surrounded by granite boulders and scraggly pines that had fought their way through cracks in the stone. The campsite was gorgeous. Flat spots for tents, an established fire ring from previous hikers, and a view across the water to where the setting sun would paint the peaks orange and pink. While setting up camp, I noticed Josh filming everything with his phone, narrating in that influencer voice people use when they think they're creating content. "Day 1 of our epic Cascade adventure," he said to the camera, panning across our camp, and I remember thinking how stupid we all looked through that screen, like actors who didn't know our parts yet. Tom and Heather had brought a 2-person tent that they struggled with for 20 minutes before Aaron helped them figure out the rainfly, and Walter chose a spot far from everyone else, almost at the edge of where the forest started again, his small green tent looking like it wanted to disappear into the trees. Dinner was freeze-dried pad thai and instant mashed potatoes cooked on portable stoves, eaten while sitting on logs around the fire Diane had built with practiced efficiency. The conversation stayed light, everyone sharing their worst hiking experiences, funny animal encounters, the usual trail talk that bonds strangers who've chosen to walk into the wilderness together. But underneath it all was this weird tension, like we were all pretending not to notice something important. Grace kept checking her phone even though we had no signal, the screen's blue glow making her face look ghostly in the growing darkness. Around 9, just as the last light was fading from the sky, Walter suddenly stood up from where he'd been sitting silent at the edge of our circle and announced he was going back to his tent. "Need to write some things down," he said, patting a journal he pulled from his jacket pocket, and the way he looked at each of us, making deliberate eye contact like he was memorizing our faces, made my chest tighten with an anxiety I couldn't name. That night I woke up at what my watch said was 2:43 in the morning to the sound of someone walking through our camp. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling each tent in what seemed like a methodical pattern. Through the thin nylon of my tent wall, I could see a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, too bright to be anyone's headlamp from our group. I held my breath, waiting for Diane's voice to ask if everything was okay, or for one of the guys to call out, but nobody said anything. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent for what must have been 30 seconds but felt like hours, and I could hear breathing, heavy and slightly ragged like someone who'd been running. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light clicked off and the footsteps moved away, not back toward any of our tents but straight into the forest, branches snapping and undergrowth rustling until the sounds faded into the ambient noise of wind through trees and water lapping at the lakeshore. The next morning at breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard the footsteps, trying to keep my voice casual while spooning instant oatmeal into my mouth. Grace immediately said yes, her relief visible that someone else had experienced it, and surprisingly, it was quiet Walter who spoke up next. "Counted the steps," he said, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. 42 around each tent. Exact same number, exact same pattern. Diane listened to all of this with the expression I couldn't read, then explained that sometimes other hikers camped nearby, that the lake was popular despite being off the main trails. But when Tom asked why someone would circle our tents at 3 in the morning, she just shrugged and changed the subject to our route for the day. As we packed up camp, I noticed Josh reviewing videos on his phone from the night before, his face growing increasingly pale. When I asked what was wrong, he turned the screen toward me, in the background of a video he'd taken of the sunset, just at the edge of frame. There was a figure standing in the trees, completely still, watching our camp. The timestamp showed 7:23 in the evening, a full 2 hours before Walter had gone to his tent, 4 hours before the midnight visitor. We hit the trail by 8, everyone quieter than the day before, that forced cheerfulness from yesterday replaced by a watchful tension that made the forest feel hostile instead of peaceful. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up toward the ridge Diane had called the sidewalk, and with each turn, I found myself looking back, expecting to see someone following. About 2 miles in, we passed another wooden post, this one marked with the number 11, and Diane picked up her pace noticeably, urging us to keep together, keep moving. We wanted to make good time to the next camp. The forest changed as we climbed. The Douglas firs gave way to subalpine species, mountain hemlock and whitebark pine twisted by decades of harsh winters, and the undergrowth thinned out, leaving nowhere for anyone to hide. Yet that feeling of being watched only intensified, like the trees themselves had developed eyes. And when we finally reached mile marker 12 just before noon, Diane stopped so abruptly that Aaron almost ran into her back. The marker was different from the others. While 11 and the original trailhead marker had been simple posts with carved numbers, 12 was surrounded by a circle of stones, each one roughly the size of a human head, placed with deliberate precision. Inside the circle, the ground was bare dirt, compacted and smooth like it had been swept clean recently, and in the center sat a pile of hiking boots, at least a dozen pairs, arranged in a neat pyramid. Some looked decades old, leather cracked and laces rotted away, while others seemed almost new, including a pair of those expensive Salomon trail runners I'd seen at REI just last month. Heather made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, and Tom pulled her close, but it was Grace who voiced what we were all thinking. Those belonged to people. Where are the people? Diane stood frozen, her face drained of all color, and for the first time since we'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. This wasn't here last month, she whispered, and that's when we heard it. A whistle, long and low, coming from somewhere up the trail, followed by another from behind us, and then another from our left, like we were being triangulated. Walter dropped his pack and started running back down the trail before anyone could react, his journal falling from his pocket and landing in the dirt near the marker. Josh grabbed it, whether out of instinct or curiosity I don't know, and flipped it open to the last entry dated that morning. They're not following us, they're hurting us. Every sound, every sighting pushing us toward marker 12. I should have left last night when I had the chance, but I needed to warn the others. If you're reading this, don't go past the stones. The bones are under the stones. God help us all. The whistles were getting closer, and now we could hear branches breaking, deliberate and unhurried, like whatever was coming knew we had nowhere to run. Diane suddenly snapped back into guide mode, shouting for everyone to stay together, to head for the ridge where we'd have better visibility. But Tom and Heather were already backing away, and Aaron was pulling Josh toward a gap in the trees, everyone scattering in different directions despite her commands. I ran with Grace and Diane, the three of us crashing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes and packs, our breathing ragged and desperate. Behind us, the whistling had stopped, which was somehow worse than hearing it. And then came sounds I'll never forget. Screaming, but cut short, like someone had hit a mute button mid-cry. First from the direction Tom and Heather had gone, then from where Aaron and Josh had disappeared, and finally, most horribly, from back down the trail where Walter had fled. Grace was crying as we ran, and Diane kept repeating, almost there, like a mantra, leading us up a steep scramble of rocks toward the ridgeline. We burst out of the tree line onto the sidewalk, a narrow spine of granite with 1,000-foot drops on either side. And for a moment we just stood there, gasping, scanning the forest below for any sign of the others. That's when Josh's phone, which I didn't even realize I'd picked up when it fell from his pack, started recording on its own, the screen showing the video app active despite no one touching it. We stayed on that ridge for 6 hours, afraid to go back down, using Diane's emergency beacon to call for help that would take until nightfall to arrive. The search and rescue team found our campsite exactly as the reports would later describe. Tent still standing, food still in the pot over dead coals like we'd just stepped away for a moment, and 7 phones arranged in a perfect circle around the fire pit, all recording nothing but wind and static. They never found Tom, Heather, Aaron, Josh, or Walter, just their boots added to the pile at marker 12, which had somehow grown to include fresh pairs despite the area being sealed off within hours. Grace and I were evacuated by helicopter, both of us dehydrated and in shock, unable to explain what had happened in any way that made sense. Diane quit guiding after that, moved to Arizona last I heard, somewhere far from mountains and trees. The official report blamed our panic on a wildlife encounter, maybe a bear or mountain lion, and the disappearances on people getting lost after separating from the group. But they never explained the boots or the stones, or why every recording device captured the same static pattern that, when analyzed, contained what audio experts described as organized but non-human vocalizations. 3 weeks after the rescue, when the story had faded from the news and the trail had been officially closed pending investigation, a ranger found my car still parked at the original trailhead. The strange thing was I'd driven home with Grace that day. We both remembered getting in her Honda and leaving my vehicle behind in our panic to get away. But there it was, keys in the ignition, my journal on the passenger seat open to a page I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine, but shaky, desperate, and all it said over and over was, "Don't go past mile marker 12," filling 3 entire pages. The last entry, dated the day after our rescue, was different. They let 3 leave so 3 could tell. The mountain needs its witnesses. Every generation, new boots for the pile, new stones for the circle. We were never lost. We were chosen. And some of us chose wrong. The police couldn't explain how my car got there, or how a journal entry could be dated after I was already home. And the therapist I've been seeing says, trauma can cause memory gaps, dissociative episodes where people do things they don't remember. I moved to Florida 6 months ago, as far from mountains as I could get. But sometimes I still wake up at 2:43 in the morning to the sound of whistling outside my window, even though I live on the 7th floor of a building surrounded by ocean. Grace calls me occasionally, always during daylight hours, and we dance around talking about what really happened, focusing instead on our new lives in flat places with no trees. Last week she mentioned finding a pair of hiking boots in her closet that she didn't remember buying. Still tagged from REI, exactly her size. I found a similar pair in my apartment yesterday, pristine Salomons that fit perfectly, and when I picked them up to throw them away, dirt fell from the treads. Dirt and small granite pebbles like the ones that surrounded marker 12. I haven't told anyone this, probably won't, but I've been having dreams where I'm back on that trail, except this time I'm the one whistling, the one walking through camps at night, counting 42 steps around each tent. In the dreams, I understand why it has to happen, why the mountain chooses who stays and who leaves, but I always wake up before I can remember the reason. All I know for certain is what I wrote in that journal, even if I can't remember writing it. If you find this, don't go past mile marker 12. "40 miles outside Asheville, tucked between ridges where cell service barely existed, stood this cabin my college roommate Victor found on some sketchy rental site for dirt cheap. January in the Appalachians meant snow packed 3 feet deep in some spots, ice coating every surface after dark, and temperatures that could kill you if you stayed outside too long without proper gear. At 28, teaching high school biology in Charlotte, I needed that isolation more than I cared to admit. Grading papers and dealing with parents had worn me down to nothing by winter break. Victor organized the whole weekend, convinced us all to drive up that Friday afternoon in 2 cars. Me, Victor, his girlfriend Allison, my buddy Cameron from work, plus Zoe and Bennett who we knew from our old trivia team downtown. Nobody questioned why the place cost so little, though we should have wondered why the owner rarely bothered maintaining it. why previous renters left such vague reviews online. Cameron stood out among us for all the wrong reasons. Rail-thin, perpetually anxious, the kind of guy who apologized for everything even when nothing needed apologizing for. While the rest of us unpacked groceries and argued about sleeping arrangements, he chain-smoked on the porch, tapping ash into an empty beer bottle he carried everywhere like some kind of security blanket. The cabin itself felt ancient, all dark wood paneling and furniture that belonged in somebody's grandmother's house circa 1975, complete with those creepy taxidermied deer heads watching us from every wall. Victor found this ancient motion sensor camera mounted by the back door, the kind hunters use to track game, covered in rust and barely functioning. We joked about it recording Bigfoot or catching bears going through the trash, never imagining we'd actually need to check what it captured. That first night passed normally enough. We drank too much bourbon, played cards until 3 in the morning, told the same college stories we always told when we got together. Saturday dragged by in a blur of hangovers and lazy conversation, everyone nursing coffee and picking at leftover pizza while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Around 9 that evening, just as we started heating up dinner, Cameron announced he needed a cigarette and headed for the back door, wearing nothing but jeans and this ratty Nirvana t-shirt he'd owned since freshman year. Allison called after him to grab his coat. The thermometer by the window showed 12 degrees, but he waved her off, said he'd only be a minute, just needed a quick smoke before we ate. We kept cooking, Victor stirring pasta while Zoe set the table, Bennett hunting through cabinets for plates that weren't chipped or stained. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and Allison started getting annoyed because the food was ready and Cameron knew we were about to eat. Victor went to the back door, yanked it open, cold air rushing in like water breaking through a dam, and called Cameron's name into the darkness. No answer came back, just wind rattling through bare branches, and that peculiar silence you only get in mountains during winter, when snow muffles everything until the world feels wrapped in cotton. We figured Cameron had wandered around to the front porch, maybe got distracted looking at stars. The sky up there stretched endless and clear, no light pollution for miles. So Bennett checked out front while I grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam across the backyard. His footprints led straight from the door to a cluster of pine trees about 30 yards away, clear as anything in the fresh snow, but they didn't come back. The tracks just ended at the tree line, like he'd stood there for a while then simply vanished into thin air. Victor kept insisting Cameron must have walked along the trees, maybe circled around to smoke somewhere else. But we all saw the same thing. One set of prints going out, nothing coming back, and beyond those pines stretched miles of wilderness where the temperature would kill you before dawn if you got lost. Panic set in differently for each of us. Allison started crying immediately. Zoe pulled out her phone even though we all knew there was no signal. Bennett ran inside to check every room like Cameron might be hiding in a closet playing some sick joke. Victor and I grabbed better flashlights, 2 heavy mag lights we found under the kitchen sink, and followed those footprints to where they ended, examining the ground for any sign of which direction Cameron might have gone. The snow past the tree line lay pristine, untouched. Not even animal tracks marking its surface, just smooth white extending into darkness between the trunks. We screamed his name until our throats went raw, the sound echoing off the mountain before dying in that oppressive quiet, and all I could think about was Cameron out there in a t-shirt, no coat, no gloves, probably dead already from hypothermia if he'd wandered too far. After an hour of searching, Victor remembered the motion sensor camera by the back door, that rusty thing we'd laughed about earlier, and suggested we check if it caught anything when Cameron went outside. The camera used these ancient SD cards, the kind from 15 years ago, and we had to dig through 3 laptops before finding one old enough to read it properly. We crowded around Zoe's ancient ThinkPad, 6 people breathing too loud in that cramped living room, waiting for the files to load while wind howled against the windows like something trying to get inside. The camera had triggered at 9:07 p.m. according to the timestamp, grainy black and white footage showing Cameron stepping out the back door, cigarette already between his lips, that empty beer bottle in his left hand for the ashes. He walked those 30 yards to the pine trees exactly like his footprints showed, stopped right at the edge where forest met yard, and just stood there facing the woods, not moving, not smoking, just standing perfectly still like someone had pressed pause on him. For 23 minutes, we watched every second. Cameron remained frozen in place while snow accumulated on his shoulders, never lighting that cigarette, never shifting his weight, never even turning his head when a deer passed within 10 feet of him around the 15-minute mark. Then, at exactly 9:30 p.m., he started walking forward into the woods with the same mechanical pace you'd use crossing a parking lot. No hesitation, no looking around, just walking straight ahead like someone had called his name from deep in those trees. The camera's range only covered about 50 feet past the tree line, but we watched him disappear into that darkness, barefoot. And this detail made everyone gasp, because somewhere between the door and the trees, he'd removed his boots and socks, left them placed neatly side by side in the snow, where we hadn't noticed them in our panic. Allison grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, whispered that people don't just walk into freezing woods barefoot, that something must have been wrong with Cameron before we even came up here. Maybe he'd been planning this all along. But I knew Cameron for 3 years, saw him every day at work, ate lunch with him in the teacher's lounge discussing lesson plans and complaining about standardized testing, and nothing about him suggested suicidal thoughts or mental illness beyond the general anxiety we all carried around like background noise. Victor rewound the footage, played it again frame by frame, and we noticed something else that made everyone stop breathing for a moment. About 5 minutes before Cameron moved, barely visible at the edge of the camera's range, another figure stood between the trees. Just a shadow really, could have been anything. A trick of the light or a tree trunk shaped weird. Except it wasn't there in the frames before or after those specific 5 minutes. And it seemed to shift slightly, swaying like someone doing that thing where you rock from foot to foot when you're waiting for something. Nobody wanted to say what we all thought, that someone had been out there watching Cameron, maybe calling to him somehow without making a sound we could hear, because acknowledging that meant accepting that our friend hadn't just wandered off in some fugue state, but had been lured into those woods by someone or something that knew exactly what they were doing. Bennett called 911 on the landline, the old rotary phone in the kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the cabin was built. And after explaining our situation 3 times to different dispatchers, they said search and rescue couldn't mobilize until morning due to the weather. Snow had picked up to near blizzard conditions, visibility down to nothing, too dangerous for helicopters or ground teams. We made our own search parties anyway, stupid and desperate, trudging through thigh-deep snow with flashlights that barely cut through the swirling white, screaming ourselves hoarse while knowing that Cameron had been out there over 2 hours now in nothing but jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot in sub-freezing temperatures. Victor and I pushed deepest into the woods, following what we thought might be footprints but turned out to be shadows and fallen branches, getting turned around twice before realizing we could die out there just as easily as Cameron, that the mountain didn't care about our friendship or guilt or need to find him. By midnight, we'd given up actively searching, huddled in the living room with every light in the cabin blazing, taking turns watching the back door like Cameron might walk through at any second with some ridiculous explanation about getting lost or finding another cabin where people invited him in for drinks. Around 3 in the morning, Zoe noticed something that made us check the footage one more time. Cameron's cigarette, the one he'd held but never smoked, wasn't in his hand when he walked into the woods. We scrubbed through the video until we found it. At the 19-minute mark, his right hand opened and the cigarette fell into the snow, followed immediately by the beer bottle from his left hand, both dropping like his fingers just stopped working. But here's what really disturbed us. His expression never changed. That blank stare never wavered, even as objects fell from his hands like his brain had disconnected from his body entirely. Victor pulled up articles on his phone about hypothermic paradox, that thing where freezing people strip their clothes off because they feel hot, but the temperature hadn't been cold enough for that severe of a reaction in such a short time. and it didn't explain the 23 minutes of absolute stillness or the way he'd walked into those woods with such purposeful, measured steps. Search and rescue arrived at first light, a team of 8 people with dogs and thermal imaging equipment, real professionals who took one look at the footage and immediately called in state police. The lead officer, this weathered woman named Sergeant Fuller, who'd worked mountain rescues for 15 years, watched the video 3 times before asking if Cameron had any history of sleepwalking, seizure disorders, or drug use, particularly dissociatives like ketamine or PCP that could cause catatonic states. We told her about the shadow figure in the trees, pointed it out on the laptop screen, and she made notes but said nothing, just exchanged this look with her partner that suggested they'd seen something like this before. The dogs picked up Cameron's scent immediately, followed it about 200 yards into the woods before losing it at a small frozen creek, the handlers explaining that he must have walked through the water for some distance, though why anyone would wade through ice water barefoot in January defied all logic unless they specifically wanted to throw off tracking dogs. They found Cameron's body 6 hours later, 4 miles from the cabin in a ravine nobody would accidentally stumble into, seated upright against a fallen log with his arms crossed over his chest like he'd arranged himself for a formal portrait before dying. The medical examiner ruled it death by exposure, no signs of violence or drugs in his system, just a man who walked into the woods and sat down to die for reasons nobody could explain. But Sergeant Fuller pulled me aside before they left, asked if we'd noticed anything strange about the cabin itself, any weird feelings or odd dreams the night before Cameron disappeared. And when I said no, she handed me her card and said something I'll never forget. Sometimes these old mountain properties have histories we don't advertise to tourists, and sometimes people sensitive to those histories respond in ways that don't make sense to the rest of us. We left that afternoon, nobody wanting to spend another night in that place, and during the drive home I finally looked up the cabin's address and found 3 similar incidents over 40 years. People walking into those same woods in winter, always underdressed, always at night, always found later in that same ravine positioned peacefully like they'd chosen to be there. The year was 2015, middle of July, and at 12 years old, summer camp seemed like the perfect escape from my parents' divorce proceedings. Camp Whispering Pines sat deep in the Sawtooth Mountains, surrounded by nothing but wilderness for miles in every direction. The brochure promised 2 weeks of hiking, swimming, and campfires, but what happened that summer still keeps me awake at night, even now at 21. My cabin group had 8 kids, all around my age, supervised by 2 college-aged counselors who spent more time flirting with each other than watching us. The camp itself consisted of wooden cabins arranged in a semicircle around a main lodge, with trails branching off into the forest like veins. Everything felt normal those first 3 days, just kids being kids, until that Wednesday afternoon when I decided to explore beyond the marked trails during our free period. The counselors always told us to stay on the designated paths, but boredom makes you stupid when you're 12. About 20 minutes into my solo adventure, pushing through thick undergrowth that scratched at my legs, I stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Hidden behind a cluster of pine trees, someone had built a crude shelter using tarps and branches, barely visible unless you were right on top of it. The blue tarp was weathered and torn in places, held down by rocks and rope tied to nearby trees. Inside, scattered across the dirt floor, were empty food wrappers from brands I recognized from our camp store, a filthy sleeping bag that reeked of sweat, and something else I couldn't identify. And what made my chest tighten with unease, a small purple backpack with cartoon unicorns on it, definitely belonging to a young child. My first instinct was to grab the backpack and run, but curiosity won over fear. Opening it with trembling fingers, I found a name written in marker on the inside flap, Lily Anderson, age 7, along with crayons, a coloring book, and a stuffed rabbit missing one eye. The pages in the coloring book were filled with disturbing drawings. Not typical kid stuff, but dark scribbles and what looked like a tall figure standing over smaller shapes. Some pages had words written in shaky handwriting. "He comes at night and wants to play games," repeated over and over. The sleeping bag had dark stains on it that I didn't want to think too hard about, and beneath it, partially buried in the dirt, I spotted what looked like strips of duct tape. That finally broke through my curiosity, sending me scrambling backwards out of the shelter, leaves crunching loudly under my feet as I ran back toward camp. Brian and Kevin, our counselors, were sitting on the lodge porch when I burst out of the tree line, gasping for air and trying to explain what I'd found. Brian, who couldn't have been older than 19, barely glanced up from his phone while Kevin laughed and ruffled my hair, telling me I'd probably just found some old campsite from hikers passing through. They said the mountains were full of people doing the trail systems, leaving stuff behind all the time, nothing to worry about. When I insisted about the child's backpack and the weird drawings, Brian finally looked at me and said, "Kids from town sometimes came up here to play in the woods, probably just forgot their stuff. Neither of them would come look at it with me, saying I shouldn't have been off the trail anyway and threatening to call my parents if I kept making up stories." The way they dismissed everything so quickly made anger burn in my chest. But what could a 12-year-old do against adults who wouldn't listen? That evening at dinner, I tried telling some of the other kids in my cabin about what I'd found, but most were too busy talking about the capture the flag game planned for the next day. Only Timothy, this quiet kid with thick glasses who read horror novels during rest time, seemed interested. He whispered that he'd heard strange noises the past 2 nights, like footsteps circling our cabin, but figured it was just counselors doing bed checks. We made plans to sneak out together the next day to look at the shelter, though neither of us really wanted to go back there. The cafeteria buzzed with normal camp chatter, complaints about the meatloaf, excitement about tomorrow's activities, gossip about which counselors were dating, while I pushed food around my plate, unable to stop thinking about those drawings and that missing girl's backpack. After dinner, during the nightly campfire, I kept scanning the dark tree line, expecting to see someone watching us, but there was only blackness beyond the fire's glow. The singing and s'mores ended around 9:30, and we all trudged back to our cabins for lights out at 10. Our cabin had 4 bunk beds, with me on a bottom bunk near the window, Timothy above me, and 6 other boys scattered throughout the room. Brian did a half-hearted head count, told us to keep it down, and left for the counselors' quarters, leaving us in darkness except for the moonlight filtering through thin curtains. Most of the guys fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's hikes, but I lay awake listening to the forest sounds. Crickets, wind through pine needles, the occasional crack of a branch. Around what must have been midnight, judging by the moon's position, those normal sounds stopped completely, leaving an unnatural silence that made my ears ring. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel path outside, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside our cabin wall. The footsteps moved along the exterior wall, pausing at each window, and I could hear breathing, deep, ragged breathing that didn't sound quite right, like someone with fluid in their lungs. When the shadow passed my window, I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the sleeping bag over my head, but I could still hear it. Then came the whispering, barely audible at first, but growing clearer as whatever it was pressed closer to the walls. It was saying our names, one by one, in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. Timothy, Matthew, Samuel. Each name drawn out, savored almost, and when it reached mine, the voice lingered, repeating it 3 times before moving on. Above me, I felt Timothy's bunk shake slightly. He was awake too, probably terrified like me. The whispering continued for maybe 10 minutes, circling our cabin twice, sometimes adding weird phrases between the names. Come play. The mountain is hungry. Lily wants friends. That last one made bile rise in my throat because I hadn't told anyone else about finding Lily's name in that backpack. By the time the footsteps finally retreated into the forest, my pillowcase was soaked with sweat and my jaw ached from clenching it so tight. I waited another hour before daring to whisper Timothy's name, and he immediately responded with a shaky, "Did you hear that too?" We stayed up the rest of the night talking in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what happened, both of us too scared to get up and find the counselors. When dawn finally broke around 5:30, painting the cabin in pale orange light, we noticed something that made our conversation die mid-sentence. Samuel's bed, 2 bunks over from mine, was empty, his sleeping bag unzipped and thrown aside like he'd left in a hurry. But Samuel was the heaviest sleeper in our cabin, the kid who once slept through a thunderstorm that shook the walls, and none of us had heard him get up during the night. Timothy and I exchanged panicked looks before I finally worked up the courage to check the cabin door, which should have been locked from the inside, but now stood slightly ajar, mud smeared across the handle. The chaos that erupted when we woke Brian was like nothing I'd ever seen at camp before. His face went from annoyed to pale in seconds when he saw Samuel's empty bed, and suddenly the lazy counselor transformed into someone barking orders and making frantic phone calls. Within an hour, the entire camp was in lockdown mode, with counselors counting and recounting kids, the camp director calling the local sheriff's department, and parent phone trees being activated. They questioned all of us repeatedly. When did we last see Samuel? Did he say anything about leaving? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? Timothy and I told them about the whispering and footsteps, and this time, Brian actually listened, his face growing more concerned with each detail. The sheriff arrived with a search and rescue team around 8 that morning, their dogs immediately picking up a scent trail leading from our cabin toward the forest. What really got everyone's attention, though, were the footprints in the mud outside, adult-sized boots heading toward the woods, and smaller barefoot prints that matched Samuel's size walking alongside them, not dragged or struggling, just walking like he'd chosen to go. The search team spent all morning combing through the woods while we were kept in the main lodge, parents being called to pick up their kids early. Around noon, one of the dogs led them straight to that hidden shelter I'd found, which was now empty except for fresh candy wrappers and something that made my whole body go cold: Samuel's inhaler, which he never went anywhere without, sitting right on top of that stained sleeping bag. The sheriff's team found more tracks leading deeper into the mountains, following old mining paths that hadn't been used in decades, but the trail went cold at a creek about 2 miles from camp. They brought in helicopters, more dogs, even volunteers from town. But as the afternoon wore on, the grim expressions on the adults' faces told us what nobody wanted to say out loud. My dad arrived around 4 to take me home, and as we drove away, I saw them bringing in more police cars and what looked like FBI agents, their black SUVs pulling up to the camp entrance. The story should have ended there, with a missing kid and a closed camp, but 3 days later something happened that still haunts me. Samuel walked out of the forest on his own, found by hikers about 15 miles from camp, dehydrated and confused but physically unharmed. The news called it a miracle. His parents cried on TV thanking everyone who searched, and the camp director gave statements about improved safety protocols. But Timothy and I stayed in touch, and he told me what Samuel said when he finally came back to school that fall. The story he only shared with a few kids before his parents moved them across the country. Samuel claimed he didn't remember leaving the cabin, just waking up in the woods with a tall man who had scars covering his neck and arms, living in different makeshift camps, moving every day. The man called himself Uncle Roy and said he was protecting special children from the mountain spirits, that he'd been collecting kids for years to keep them safe. Samuel remembered other children too, maybe 3 or 4, hiding in caves during the day, including a little girl who matched the age Lily would have been, though she never spoke, just drew pictures constantly with crayons. According to Samuel, on the 3rd night, Uncle Roy got spooked by something, packed up their camp in minutes, and told Samuel he wasn't ready yet before pointing him toward a trail and disappearing into the darkness. The police never found any Uncle Roy, no other children, no caves matching Samuel's descriptions, nothing but more abandoned campsites scattered throughout those mountains. The official report blamed it on trauma-induced false memories, maybe Stockholm Syndrome, and the case was quietly closed. Camp Whispering Pines never reopened. The property sold to developers who turned it into vacation homes, and most people forgot about that strange week in 2015. But I know what I heard that night. Those whispers calling our names, and sometimes I wonder about all the missing hiker reports from that area over the years. I think about Lily Anderson, and whether she's still out there somewhere with Uncle Roy, drawing pictures in the dark, waiting for him to decide she's finally ready for whatever the mountain supposedly wants. I never went camping again after that summer, and even now, living in a city apartment far from any mountains, I still check my locks twice before bed and listen for footsteps that shouldn't be there. The dirt road to our campsite stretched for miles through Utah's backcountry, kicking up red dust that coated everything in the car. Hannah had her feet up on the dashboard, painting her toenails this bright purple color while I navigated the potholes and washouts. We'd been together long enough that these camping trips had become our ritual. Every few months we'd pack the Jeep and disappear into the wilderness for a weekend. She worked 12-hour shifts at the pediatric ward in Denver, and teaching biology to teenagers had me grading papers until midnight most nights, so by August we desperately needed this escape. The camping spot we'd found online was supposed to be this hidden plateau near Moab, far enough from the tourist trails that we'd have total privacy. After 4 hours of driving and another hour on unmarked roads, we finally reached the coordinates some random user had posted on a backcountry forum. Setting up camp on that clifftop felt like we'd discovered our own private paradise. The tent went up on this perfectly flat stretch of sandstone, maybe 50 feet from where the ground dropped away into a massive canyon system. Hannah started organizing our gear, while I gathered dead juniper branches for a fire, and we spent the afternoon exploring the rim trail and taking pictures of each other against the dramatic backdrop. Dinner was just freeze-dried pasta, but sitting there watching the rocks turn from orange to deep red to purple as the sun dropped made everything taste better. We were washing our dishes with the last of our water bottles when Hannah suddenly stopped mid-sentence and nodded toward the far side of the canyon. A figure stood at the opposite rim, probably 300 yards away but clearly visible against the lighter sky. Just standing there at the very edge, facing directly toward our camp, completely motionless like he'd been carved from the rock itself. We figured it was another camper enjoying the view. People did weird things in nature, and watching sunsets from dramatic vantage points wasn't unusual. But the guy never moved, not even to shift his weight or adjust his stance. Hannah waved at him, that friendly kind of wave you give other hikers on trails, but he didn't respond. After about 10 minutes of us periodically glancing over while we finished cleaning up, the darkness finally swallowed him up. We laughed about it, making jokes about meditation retreats and people taking those mindfulness apps too seriously. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, so we crawled into our sleeping bags early, played cards by headlamp for a while, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the canyon below. Nothing else seemed unusual that first night, just the typical sounds of the desert, little animals rustling in the brush, an owl calling somewhere in the distance. Saturday morning came bright and clear, with that intense desert sun that makes you grateful for any patch of shade. We made instant coffee on the camp stove and planned out a longer hike down into the canyon itself, following what looked like an old deer trail we'd spotted the day before. The whole day was fantastic. We found this hidden spring surrounded by cottonwood trees at the canyon bottom, saw a family of bighorn sheep navigating the cliff faces, and Hannah discovered some pottery shards that must have been centuries old. We made it back to camp around 5 in the afternoon, dusty and exhausted but exhilarated. While Hannah rested in the tent, I started preparing dinner, cutting up vegetables on our little folding table. That's when I noticed him again. Same spot on the opposite rim, same eerily still posture, facing our camp exactly like the night before. The unease hit me harder this time. Nobody stands in the exact same spot 2 evenings in a row, especially not at the edge of a cliff where one wrong step means certain death. I called Hannah out of the tent and pointed him out, and we both stared across the canyon trying to make out any details. He wore dark clothing, maybe black or deep brown, and had something covering his head, possibly a hood or a hat with a wide brim. We couldn't see his face clearly, but the way his body angled toward us left no doubt about where his attention was focused. Hannah suggested yelling across to him, asking if he needed help or something, but the canyon swallowed up her voice before it got halfway across. The wind had picked up, creating this low humming sound as it moved through the rock formations, and somehow that made the whole scene feel more isolated and wrong. We decided to eat dinner inside the tent that night, zipping up all the windows and trying to pretend everything was normal. But every few minutes, one of us would peek through the mesh window to check if he was still there. He was, for nearly 2 hours, until darkness finally erased him from view. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both kept our headlamps within easy reach and spoke in hushed voices like we might be overheard. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee, and as I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, my headlamp beam swept across the ground near our car. There in the fine red dust were footprints, boots with deep treads, forming a complete circle around the vehicle. They weren't there when we'd parked, and they definitely weren't ours. My heart started hammering as I followed the tracks with my light, seeing how they came from the direction of the canyon rim, circled our car multiple times, then led straight toward our tent before veering off back into the darkness. I woke Hannah immediately, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what I'd found. She grabbed her headlamp and we both went outside, following the footprints together. The tracks stopped about 3 feet from our tent's rainfly, and there were deeper impressions there like someone had stood in that spot for a long time, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Hannah found something else that made my mouth go dry. Cigarette butts, at least a dozen of them, crushed into the dirt right where the person had been standing. The brand was torn off each one, leaving just the white filters, and they were arranged in a small, deliberate pile. We'd been sleeping maybe 4 feet from where this stranger had been standing, smoking cigarettes and watching our tent in the darkness. The nearest ranger station was over 20 miles away on roads with no cell service, and our gas gauge had been hovering near empty since we'd arrived. We threw everything into the car in record time, not even bothering to properly pack the tent, just wadding it up and shoving it in the back. Hannah held a knife from our camp kitchen while I started the engine, and we both kept scanning the darkness beyond the headlights. The gas gauge needle sat just barely above the red line, and I knew the math didn't work. 20 miles of rough dirt road climbing up and down hills would drain what little fuel we had left, but staying felt impossible after seeing those footprints and cigarette butts. As I put the Jeep in reverse to turn around, the headlight swept across the canyon rim where the man had been standing. He was there again, visible in the beam for just a second, but this time he was moving, walking along the rim parallel to the direction we'd have to drive. Hannah saw him too, and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, whispering that he knew exactly which road we'd have to take out. We sat there with the engine running, weighing our options. The math was simple and terrifying. We had maybe enough gas for 15 miles if we drove carefully, but the main highway was over 20 miles away. The dirt road had several steep climbs that would burn fuel even faster. Staying meant spending the night with someone who'd already proven they could reach our camp unseen, someone who'd stood inches from where we slept. Going meant potentially getting stranded on a dark mountain road with this person knowing exactly where we'd be stuck. Hannah remembered seeing an old Forest Service cabin on our way in, maybe 8 miles back, with what looked like a radio antenna on the roof. It was a gamble, but 8 miles we could definitely make, and maybe the cabin would have emergency supplies or a way to call for help. I turned the Jeep toward the road, driving slowly to conserve fuel, while Hannah kept watch behind us with her headlamp, looking for any sign of following headlights. The road seemed different in the darkness, every shadow potentially hiding someone, every curve blind to what might be waiting ahead. We drove in tense silence, the fuel gauge dropping steadily toward empty. About 4 miles in, Hannah suddenly yelled for me to stop. There was a vehicle parked just off the road ahead, barely visible through the juniper trees. It was an old pickup truck, rust-colored or maybe just covered in dirt, with no lights on and positioned so it partially blocked the narrow road. We couldn't see if anyone was inside it. I reversed about 50 yards and found a spot where I could turn around if needed, keeping the engine running while we debated what to do. That's when we heard it. Another engine starting up behind us, back the direction of our campsite. No headlights appeared, but the sound grew steadily closer. Someone driving in complete darkness on roads that were treacherous even in daylight. Hannah made the decision for both of us. She grabbed the wheel and yanked it hard to the right, sending us crashing through the sagebrush and around the parked truck. We scraped past with inches to spare, the passenger mirror snapping off against its tailgate, and I floored it up the next hill. The gas gauge dropped into the red, and the engine started that stuttering hesitation that meant we were running on fumes. Behind us, headlights suddenly blazed to life, both from the parked truck and the vehicle that had been following. They lit up the dust cloud we'd left behind, and I could see them in the mirrors gaining on us fast. The Forest Service cabin appeared just as the engine died completely, our momentum carrying us into what used to be a parking area. It was more rundown than we'd realized passing it earlier. Windows boarded up, door hanging off its hinges. But Hannah was already out and running toward it before I'd even set the parking brake. The cabin was a mess inside. Furniture overturned and graffiti covering the walls, but the radio setup in the corner still had power from a solar panel on the roof. Hannah figured out how to work it while I barricaded the door with everything I could move. Through the cracked boards over the windows, I could see headlights pulling into the parking area, then darkness as they switched them off. The radio crackled to life just as we heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside, and Hannah practically screamed our location and situation to whoever was listening. A ranger's voice came back, saying they were 45 minutes out, but they were coming with backup. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, methodically, stopping at each window. Then nothing. Just silence for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes. When we finally heard the approaching sirens and saw the emergency lights through the boards, we found the parking area empty except for our Jeep. The rangers said they'd passed no vehicles on the road coming up. Whoever it was had vanished into the wilderness, leaving only tire tracks and the memory of that terrible night. We never went camping in remote areas again. The air at Paradise Base that morning carried a strange stillness, the kind that made every sound sharper. I had been guiding climbs for almost a decade, and Mount Rainier was supposed to be routine compared to the Himalayas. My name's Daniel, and that week I was part of a 4-person team prepping for a technical ascent before the next storm front closed in. The mountain looked deceptively calm from below, sunlight hitting its ridges like polished glass, but everyone knew how fast it could turn. We were scheduled for a 5-day push, 2 nights at high camp, nothing extraordinary. Or at least that was the plan. Our team consisted of seasoned climbers. Emily, a paramedic from Montana with a quiet focus that made you trust her instantly. Marcus, the oldest of us, whose humor kept the air light even when conditions didn't. And Eric, a new addition who'd just returned from Denali. I had met Eric through a mutual friend, and though he was competent, there was something in his silence that I couldn't quite read. We spent the first day hiking through dense fog, the ice crunching under our crampons, our breath clouding like steam as we adjusted to the altitude. The climb itself felt routine, until we reached an area I didn't recognize on the map. The ridge flattened into a narrow plateau, a place scoured by wind and time. That was where we saw them. The remains of tents half buried in snow, guy lines torn and tangled, cooking gear scattered like someone had fled in a hurry. Marcus crouched down, brushing away the frost from a sleeping bag that had frozen stiff. "This wasn't here last season," he muttered. I noticed a torn patch of fabric marked with a logo from an old expedition company that had folded 2 years earlier. The same one connected to the missing team whose bodies were never recovered. We all went silent for a moment, The radio static broke the quiet, faint but distinct, as if whispering through the wind. That night, the mountain didn't rest. The wind roared against the fabric of our tents, and every now and then the static on the radio would spike into bursts. But it wasn't random. We could make out words. Our words. Conversations we had earlier that day, replaying with eerie precision, like the mountain itself had been listening. Emily tried to rationalize it, said the cold might have been interfering with the frequency, but I could tell she didn't believe it. None of us did. The air inside the tent felt charged, the kind of tension that makes you hesitate to even breathe too loudly. By the second night, the weather had started closing in. Clouds rolled down from the upper ridges like slow smoke, swallowing everything in white. We built snow walls around the tents and anchored them deeper, though the wind still managed to slip through in thin howls. I barely slept. The radio kept crackling, faint echoes of our voices rising and fading like they were being pulled apart. Around 3 a.m, Marcus swore he heard footsteps circling outside. He unzipped the tent, flashlight cutting through the snow, but there was no one there. Only the static, now louder, like heavy breathing between bursts of noise. Morning brought a grim silence. The storm had buried most of our tracks, but one was unmistakable. A single trail of fresh boot prints leading away from camp, heading higher into the slope. Eric was gone. His tent flap was open, his pack still inside, along with his gloves and rope harness. We called his name until our throats burned, but the mountain swallowed the sound whole. Emily wanted to go after him immediately, but climbing higher in that storm was suicide. We radioed base for help, but all we got back was a wall of interference, fragments of words we couldn't make out. As the hours dragged on, small things began to shift around camp. A carabiner that had been on the cooking line ended up half buried 10 meters away. My ice axe, which I'd left propped against a snow wall, was lying beside my tent with its handle cracked. Emily said she thought she saw someone moving near the edge of the ridge, a dark outline against the wind. But when we went to check, there was only open snow. That was when Marcus started saying we were being followed, that maybe Eric hadn't wandered off at all. His voice had that trembling edge that makes you realize fear is starting to win. That night, the static returned, not as background noise, but as a voice. It called each of our names, repeating them in order, with a delay that didn't match any radio pattern I'd ever heard. Sometimes it mimicked what we said seconds after we said it. Other times it whispered words none of us had spoken. Emily tried switching channels, but every frequency bled into the same hollow echo. The mountain sounded alive, and whatever it was, wind, interference, or something else entirely, it wanted us to hear it. By dawn, Marcus was gone too. His tent had collapsed under the snow, and only one line of prints led away, the same direction as Eric's. It did not make sense. No one would climb higher without gear or oxygen. Emily and I packed up what we could, planning to descend before the storm worsened. Every step felt like walking through static. The air hummed around us, and sometimes through the wind, I swore I heard Marcus shouting my name. It sounded close, but when I turned, the slope stretched empty in every direction. I stopped answering after a while. Midway down the glacier, our radio came alive again. The voice on the other end sounded like me. Same tone, same pauses, saying words I had not spoken yet. It repeated my last sentence seconds before I could finish it, overlapping itself like an echo that shouldn't exist. Emily dropped the radio in panic. When I picked it up, the voice changed. It was Eric now, calm and deliberate, saying, "You left me up here." The transmission cut into white noise so sharp it hurt to listen. We made it back to base late that night, frostbitten and half delirious. The rescue team that went up 2 days later found no trace of Marcus or Eric. Their prints stopped near a crevasse, but the snow had swallowed everything else. The old camp we found was gone too. Tents, gear, all of it buried under a fresh drift as if it had never existed. The only thing left behind was our broken radio, sitting on the surface where we had left it. Power light still flickering even though the batteries were dead. It has been years since that climb. I still guide expeditions, but I have never returned to Mount Rainier. Sometimes, late at night, I leave my radio on just for the background noise. Every once in a while, through the hiss of static, I hear it, my own voice calling out names I have tried hard to forget. The mountains had always been my refuge, a place where silence felt like an old friend, rather than something to fear. I had been a ranger for almost a decade, used to long stretches of solitude and unpredictable weather, but that night was different. I had been assigned to drive through a remote pass to check a maintenance station that had gone quiet. My shift was supposed to end before midnight, yet the road wound endlessly upward through dark pines that swallowed the light from my headlights. The only sound was the steady hum of the truck's engine and the occasional snap of gravel under the tires. About halfway through the pass, the fog appeared. Not rolling in from the valleys like it normally would, it rose, thick and milky, from the ground itself. It was so sudden that I thought I was driving through smoke from a nearby fire. I slowed down, trying to find the yellow lines, but they vanished under the gray blanket. The air outside the window had that cold, heavy stillness that made the world feel suspended. I kept the engine running and leaned forward, squinting at what looked like a faint glow just ahead, but the light moved, sideways, then backward, like it was circling me. I grabbed the radio, trying to call the dispatch office. Static hissed for a few seconds before something else cut through. It was a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It said my name. Not once, but several times, each with a different tone. One sounded like it came from a child. Another was deeper, like someone whispering directly into the mic. I thought maybe I'd stumbled into interference from another channel, but when I turned the volume down, the voice grew louder. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was in the air, thin, echoing like it was being carried by the fog itself. The fear didn't hit me all at once. It crept in quietly, the kind that makes you question if your mind is playing tricks. I turned off the engine to listen, and for a few seconds, there was nothing. Just the soft hiss of wind against metal. Then, a tap on the side of the truck. Just one, then another. I spun the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only showed my own breath hanging in the cold. The fog seemed thicker near the trees, pulsing slightly, like it was breathing. I remember gripping the wheel, waiting for something, anything to move, but everything stayed impossibly still. The whispers returned, but this time they came from the passenger side, soft at first, then overlapping like several voices speaking over one another. My own name again, drawn out, almost affectionate. I told myself it had to be the wind. There was no other rational explanation. Still, I could not ignore the way the fog pressed against the glass as if it had weight, forming faint shapes that shifted whenever I blinked. One moment I thought I saw a handprint on the window. The next, it was gone. The fog wasn't moving with the wind. It was moving against it. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I started the truck again and tried reversing, but the tires only spun on the gravel. The headlights were swallowed by the white wall around me. That was when I noticed the clock on the dashboard. It had stopped. The seconds weren't ticking. I tapped the glass, then my wristwatch, but both were frozen at the same time. 12:03. I blinked, checked again. Still 12:03. The air inside the truck had turned icy, every breath forming a small cloud. My radio crackled to life once more, and this time it wasn't just voices. It was breathing, deep, close, and uneven, like someone sitting right behind me. I turned, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The beam cut through the fog-filled cabin, revealing nothing but my own jacket slung over the back seat. I remember whispering, "Who's there?" without even realizing I'd said it aloud. No answer came, but something brushed the edge of the truck bed, a soft scrape, followed by a low knock. 3 times. Each sound landed like it was measured, deliberate. I pressed the horn, half hoping to startle whatever was out there, but it didn't echo back. It was swallowed by the fog as if the air itself had absorbed it. The next thing I remember clearly is the silence that followed. I must have sat there for hours, though it felt like minutes. My eyes kept darting between the windshield and the rearview mirror, even though I could barely see past my own reflection. I thought about stepping out, walking until I found a signal, but something about the fog made that feel like stepping into a dream I wouldn't wake from. The edges of my vision began to blur. I don't know if I passed out or if something else happened, but the next time I opened my eyes, the truck was bathed in pale light. Dawn had come, but not the way it should have. The fog thinned in slow spirals, peeling away like smoke. My hands were stiff on the steering wheel, my neck sore as if I had been sleeping upright for hours. When I stepped out, the air hit me with a strange stillness, heavy with dew. The road behind me was gone. Where the asphalt should have been, there was a cliff, a sheer drop stretching down into mist. My tire marks ended right at the edge. I stood there staring, unable to figure out how I could have driven that far without noticing. The GPS on the dashboard was still blinking, the screen faintly flickering. The coordinates didn't make sense. They placed me in a blank section of terrain, miles from the nearest mapped road. According to the tracker, the truck had been parked there for 7 hours straight. 7 hours that I couldn't account for. My last memory before dawn had been of the fog pressing against the glass, and then nothing. I checked the clock again. It was working now. 7:13. The radio hissed softly with low static, and just beneath it, a voice whispered my name once more, clear as breath against my ear. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, no one believed the story. They said fog banks in the mountains could cause disorientation, that maybe I had fallen asleep from exhaustion, but I knew I hadn't dreamed it. I showed them the GPS data, but when they checked it later, the file was gone, completely wiped. The coordinates I had written down on paper led to nothing but dense forest. The pass itself wasn't even listed on the updated maps anymore, as if it had never existed. I still patrol that region sometimes, though I avoid that route. On certain mornings when the weather turns gray, I hear faint static through my handheld radio, a sound too familiar to ignore. Once I thought I heard my name again, carried by a gust of wind that came from nowhere. I stopped answering after that. Whatever happened in that fog, whatever called to me through it, I am certain of one thing. If I had stepped out of that truck that night, I would not have found my way back. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Psychiatric hospitals in the 70s weren't what people imagine today. They were isolated fortresses, where experimental treatments happened behind locked doors and nobody asked questions. My residency at Clearwater Psychiatric Institute started right after medical school, when 26 still felt old enough to change the world, but young enough to trust the wrong people. The facility occupied 40 acres of pine forest in Northern California, about 2 hours from Sacramento, housing 300 patients separated into wings based on diagnosis and severity. Dr. Gregory Hoffman ran the women's ward where I'd been assigned, a man approaching his 60s with silver hair perpetually slicked back, and these pale gray eyes that held your gaze without blinking, like he was reading something written on the inside of your skull. My duties seemed routine at first. Patient evaluations, medication rounds, behavioral documentation, all the standard tasks that would supposedly prepare me for running my own practice one day. The other residents complained about the isolation, the outdated equipment, the way certain doors stayed locked even to medical staff, but I figured every hospital had its quirks and protocols. Everything shifted one October evening when Dr. Hoffman kept me after my shift ended, leading me through parts of the building my keycard had never opened before. We passed 2 security checkpoints, where guards examined special clearance badges I didn't know existed, then descended a stairwell into a basement corridor with no windows and fluorescent tubes that buzzed like angry wasps trapped in the ceiling. He explained I'd been selected for a classified research project with federal funding, revolutionary trauma treatment that could transform our understanding of how the human mind processes and releases psychological damage. The way he presented it felt almost religious. We would administer controlled doses of lysergic acid diethylamide to female patients with severe emotional trauma, using the drug's properties to essentially dissolve the barriers their minds had built around traumatic memories, allowing us to guide them through reprocessing these experiences in a controlled therapeutic environment. He produced a manila folder thick with consent forms, each one signed and notarized, assuring me that every legal requirement had been satisfied, though the sensitive nature of the research meant absolute discretion, even from colleagues who weren't part of what he called the project team. The first session I observed took place in a room they'd converted from an old surgical theater. White walls, one-way observation glass, and a reclining chair that looked more like a dentist's setup than anything psychiatric. The patient was Diane, 32 years old, admitted for severe depression after losing her daughter in a drowning accident 3 years prior. Dr. Hoffman administered the LSD through a sugar cube, precisely dosed at 200 micrograms, while I monitored her vitals and took notes on the special forms they'd designed for the project. Within 40 minutes, Diane's pupils dilated until her brown eyes looked almost black, and she began describing colors bleeding through the walls like watercolors in rain. Dr. Hoffman guided her with this steady hypnotic voice, asking her to revisit the day of the accident, to walk through it frame by frame while the drug dismantled whatever defensive walls her mind had built. She started crying, then laughing, then making these sounds I'd never heard from a human throat, something between singing and wailing that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. What disturbed me wasn't just the intensity of her reaction, but how Dr. Hoffman responded to it, leaning forward with this expression of fascination while scribbling notes in shorthand I couldn't read. He increased the dose for the next session without consulting me, pushing it to 350 micrograms, explaining that we needed to break through the resistance to reach the actual trauma. During that second session, Diane clawed at her arms until she drew blood, convinced that insects were crawling beneath her skin, carrying messages from her dead daughter. I wanted to intervene, to give her something to calm the hallucinations, but Dr. Hoffman grabbed my wrist and held it with surprising strength, telling me that interrupting the process would invalidate months of preparation. 2 other doctors I'd never seen before watched from behind the observation glass, taking their own notes, occasionally speaking into tape recorders they held close to their mouths. By the 3rd week, we had 12 women participating in the project, each one dealing with different traumas: sexual assault, childhood abuse, loss of children, domestic violence that had left both physical and psychological scars. The sessions grew longer, sometimes stretching 8 or 9 hours, with doses that would have been considered dangerous in any legitimate therapeutic setting. Dr. Hoffman introduced what he called guided reconstruction, where he would suggest new narratives while the patients were deep in their hallucinations, trying to overwrite their traumatic memories with fabricated ones. He'd tell a woman who'd been raped that it had been a dream, that she'd actually spent that night safe in her childhood bedroom, and in their altered state, some of them would begin to believe it, at least temporarily. The morning after these sessions, the confusion in their eyes when reality reasserted itself was painful to witness. They'd look at me like drowning people reaching for something solid, but I had no answers that would help them make sense of what was real anymore. The night everything went wrong, we were working with a patient named Janet, a 28-year-old who'd been admitted after multiple suicide attempts following a miscarriage. She'd been in the program for 2 weeks, and Dr. Hoffman had been pushing her doses higher each session, convinced he was close to what he called a breakthrough moment. That evening, he gave her 500 micrograms, more than double a standard therapeutic dose, while soft classical music played through speakers mounted in the ceiling corners. For the first hour, Janet lay still on the reclined chair, her eyes moving rapidly behind closed lids like she was in REM sleep, occasionally mumbling words I couldn't make out. Then her breathing changed, becoming these deep rhythmic pants like a woman in labor, and her hands moved to her stomach, pressing and kneading the flesh through her hospital gown. Dr. Hoffman leaned forward in his chair, that familiar gleam of fascination brightening his gray eyes as he began speaking to Janet in a low, measured tone, telling her she was safe, that she was bringing life into the world, that everything was happening exactly as it should. Janet's movements became more agitated, her fingers clawing at the hospital gown until she'd torn it open, revealing her pale stomach covered in old self-harm scars that looked like a map of her suffering. She kept repeating, "The baby's coming, the baby's coming," her voice rising with each repetition until it became a shriek that echoed off the white walls. I reached for the sedatives we kept prepared, but Dr. Hoffman raised his hand to stop me, insisting we needed to let the experience complete itself, that interrupting now would cause psychological fragmentation. Behind the observation glass, the 2 unnamed doctors had pressed closer, one of them filming with a small camera I hadn't noticed before, capturing every moment of Janet's unraveling. What happened next still appears in my nightmares, vivid as the moment I witnessed it. Janet's fingers, still convinced she was delivering a child, began tearing at her abdomen with her fingernails, ripping through skin with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Blood spread across the white leather of the chair, pooling beneath her, and she was laughing. This horrible, joyous laughter like she'd accomplished something miraculous. Dr. Hoffman finally moved then, but not to help her. He grabbed my shoulders and positioned me between himself and Janet, using me as a shield while shouting for the security guards. By the time they restrained her and I managed to stop the bleeding with compression and emergency sutures, she'd carved deep gashes across her stomach, muttering about holding her baby, asking why we'd taken it away when she'd worked so hard to bring it back. The aftermath was chaos disguised as protocol. Nurses appeared from nowhere to transfer Janet to the medical wing. Documents were signed and countersigned, and Dr. Hoffman spoke in hushed tones with the observers who packed up their recording equipment with practiced efficiency. Nobody would tell me Janet's condition beyond stable, and when I tried to check on her the next morning, I found her room empty, the bed stripped down to the mattress, no record in the system that she'd ever been transferred to medical. Dr. Hoffman called me into his office that afternoon, sliding a stack of papers across his mahogany desk, a non-disclosure agreement that went on for pages, full of legal language about federal classification and penalties for unauthorized disclosure that included prison time. He reminded me about my student loans, about how the project's funding included a generous bonus that would clear my debts, about how my participation would be noted favorably in my residency evaluation. His gray eyes never blinked as he explained that Janet had been transferred to a specialized facility for intensive care, that her family had been notified, that everything was being handled according to established protocols. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, about the 11 other women still in the program, about the doses that kept climbing, and the observers with their cameras and tape recorders. That night, I snuck back into the restricted wing using my access card, planning to copy patient files to find some evidence of what was really happening. The filing room was exactly where I expected, but when I opened the cabinet marked with our project code, I found something that made my chest tighten with panic. Hundreds of files, dating back years before the program supposedly started, each one documenting similar experiments with different drugs, different methods, but always the same focus on female patients with trauma. The earliest files were from 1965, and at the bottom of each one was a stamp I recognized from news articles about congressional hearings. MK Ultra Sub-Project 58, Psychochemical vulnerability studies. I grabbed as many files as I could carry, stuffing them into my medical bag, knowing I had minutes before security did their rounds. The documents painted a picture of systematic experimentation that made my stomach churn. Women who'd been given massive doses of LSD combined with electroshock therapy, others subjected to sensory deprivation while hallucinating, detailed notes about personality reconstruction and memory dissolution that read more like science fiction than medicine. One file contained photographs that I wish I could forget. Women with vacant eyes, some catatonic, others clearly in states of permanent psychosis, all marked as project outcomes unsuccessful. The most recent file was dated just 3 days ago, and when I opened it, Janet's admission photo stared back at me. But the status section was stamped with something that made no sense. Subject relocated, Montreal facility, further testing required. I photographed everything with the small camera I'd bought for documenting patient progress, my fingers trembling so badly I had to retake several shots. The next morning, I arrived at work to find my keycard deactivated and 2 federal agents waiting in the lobby with Dr. Hoffman, who wouldn't meet my eyes as they explained I was being transferred immediately to a VA hospital in Texas, that my residency would continue there with full credit, that my moving expenses would be covered. They made it clear this wasn't a request. My apartment had already been packed, my belongings were in a truck, and a plane ticket was waiting at the airport. The agents escorted me to my car, one of them mentioning casually that they knew about my late-night visit to the filing room, that the cameras had captured everything, but they were willing to overlook it if I honored my agreements and relocated quietly. Dr. Hoffman disappeared 2 days after I left. I heard through medical school contacts that he'd simply vanished. His office cleaned out overnight. No forwarding address, like he'd never existed at all. I kept those photographs hidden for years, moving them from one safe deposit box to another, too terrified to release them but unable to destroy the only proof I had that those women weren't imagining their nightmares. Eventually, I reached out to a journalist investigating MK Ultra projects, giving him copies of everything under the condition of anonymity, and while he published articles about government-funded LSD experiments, Clearwater Institute was never mentioned by name. It had been shuttered and demolished by then, replaced by a shopping complex as if 40 acres of pine forest had never held those buildings at all. I tracked down 3 of the women from the project through medical records and careful searching. 2 were in long-term psychiatric facilities, their minds never fully recovering from what we'd done, and the 3rd had changed her name and moved to Canada, refusing to speak with me when I finally found her number. Janet was nowhere in any system I could access, as if she'd been erased from existence completely, though sometimes I wonder if that Montreal facility stamp meant something darker than just a transfer. I finished my residency in Texas, built a small practice, tried to help people the right way, but I never stopped carrying the weight of those months at Clearwater. The camera I used to photograph those files sits in my desk drawer, the film long since developed and hidden away, a reminder of how easily medical ethics can be abandoned when someone promises you're serving a greater purpose. Whenever a patient talks about trusting their doctor completely, about putting their mental health in someone else's hands, I remember Janet's screams, the blood on that white chair, and Dr. Hoffman's gray eyes watching it all with scientific detachment. The truth is, I got away because they let me go. I was small, insignificant, just a resident who could be relocated and silenced with the right combination of threats and incentives. The real architects of that project, the ones who funded it and collected the data, they're probably still out there. Their names hidden behind classified stamps and government clearance levels I'll never have access to. I worked as an intern at Riverside State Hospital in Illinois during the spring of 2018, fresh out of my master's program and eager to make a difference in psychiatric care. At 26, I thought I understood how the system worked, the protocols, the hierarchies, the way things had to be done for everyone's safety. My supervisor, Dr. Harold Brennan, had been there for 32 years and ran the long-term ward with the efficiency of a military operation. Every morning I'd arrive at 7 sharp, badge in through 3 security checkpoints, and spend my days reviewing patient files, sitting in on group therapy sessions, and learning the careful dance of institutional psychiatry. The building itself was a relic from the 1950s, all pale green walls and narrow windows with wire mesh, the kind of place where footsteps echoed down empty corridors long after the person had passed. Among the 43 patients in our ward, one stood out to me from my first week: Robert Garrison, a 61-year-old man who'd been there for 11 years. Unlike the others who shuffled through their routines with vacant stares or muttered to invisible companions, Robert was articulate, almost desperately so. Every time I passed his room during rounds, he'd be at his small desk, writing letters to lawyers who never wrote back, filling yellow legal pads with meticulous notes about his case. His room was organized like a law office, newspaper clippings taped to the walls in chronological order, court documents filed in makeshift folders he'd fashioned from commissary paper bags, everything dated and cross-referenced. He claimed he'd been framed for his wife's murder, that someone had planted evidence and manipulated his confession, and while every patient had their story, there was something about the precision of his arguments that made me pause during those early morning rounds. It was a Thursday in May when I decided to pull Robert's court files from the archive room in the basement. Dr. Brennan was at a conference in Chicago, and I told myself I was just being thorough, learning about our patients' histories to better understand their conditions. The archive room smelled like mildew and old paper, rows of metal filing cabinets stretching back into darkness where the overhead fluorescents had burned out years ago. Robert's file was thick as a phone book, crammed with psychiatric evaluations, police reports, and trial transcripts from 2007. His wife, Catherine, had been found dead in their bathtub, drowned after being struck on the head with a ceramic lamp from their bedroom. The prosecution's case seemed solid: Robert's fingerprints on the lamp, neighbors who heard them arguing that night, and most damning, his own detailed confession given 3 days after the murder during a therapy session with Dr. Milton Cross, a specialist in recovered memory techniques who'd been brought in by the police. But as I read through the confession transcript by the light of my phone's flashlight, something strange jumped out at me. The language didn't match Robert's speaking patterns at all. The confession was full of psychiatric jargon and clinical terms that a high school math teacher wouldn't naturally use. Phrases like dissociative episode and affective dysregulation peppered the document, and the description of the murder read like something from a forensic textbook rather than a person recounting their own actions. I found the audio recording reference number at the bottom of the page and searched through the evidence boxes until I located an old cassette tape labeled R. Garrison, Session 3, May 15, 2007. My heart was pounding as I climbed back upstairs to find a player, borrowing one from the occupational therapy room, where they still use tapes for relaxation exercises. The tape was horrifying to listen to, not because of what Robert said, but because of how he said it. Dr. Cross's voice was smooth and insistent, guiding Robert through what he called a therapeutic hypnosis session to unlock suppressed memories. For the first 20 minutes, Robert sounded drowsy, almost drugged, responding to questions about his childhood, his marriage, mundane details about his daily routine. Then Cross's questioning shifted, became more directed. "You were angry that night, weren't you, Robert? Catherine had been seeing someone else. You picked up the lamp from the nightstand. You can see yourself doing it now, can't you?" And Robert's voice, flat and monotone like someone reading from a script they didn't understand, began describing the murder in that clinical language I'd found so jarring in the transcript. Every few minutes you could hear Cross saying, "That's good, Robert, go deeper now, tell me what you see." By the end of the 90-minute tape, Robert had confessed to a murder that sounded more like Cross's interpretation of events than any genuine memory. I spent the entire weekend researching Dr. Milton Cross online, and what I found made my skin prickle with unease. He'd been involved in at least 6 other cases between 2004 and 2009, where defendants had given similarly detailed confessions under hypnosis, all using that same clinical vocabulary, all later convicted based primarily on those confessions. 2 of those defendants had killed themselves in prison, 1 had been declared incompetent to stand trial after a mental breakdown, and the others were serving life sentences. Cross himself had disappeared from public records after 2009, though I found an obituary from 2011 saying he'd died in a car accident in Nevada. But here's what really got to me. In each case, Cross had been hired as a consultant, not by the defense or the prosecution, but by a private firm called Behavioral Solutions, Inc., which had contracts with various police departments for specialized interrogation support. The company had dissolved in 2010, just months after Cross's last documented case. Monday morning, I arrived at work an hour early, my laptop bag heavy with printed articles and copies I'd made of Robert's file at a 24-hour copy shop. I planned to present everything to Dr. Brennan, convince him we needed to contact Robert's public defender, maybe even reach out to the Innocence Project. Robert must have sensed something different about me when I stopped by his room during morning rounds, because he looked up from his writing with an expression I'd never seen before. Hope, raw and desperate. "You found something," he said. Not a question, but a statement, and I nodded slightly, whispering that I was working on it, that he needed to stay calm and give me a few days. The way his eyes filled with tears, the way he gripped his pencil so tight it snapped in half. I'll never forget that moment. I spent the rest of my shift documenting everything meticulously, creating a detailed report with timestamps from the tape, citations from Cross's other cases, and a formal recommendation for case review. But when I came in Wednesday morning, everything had changed. Robert wasn't at his desk when I passed his room. He was sitting on his bed, staring at the wall, a line of drool running down his chin. The charge nurse, Beverly, informed me that Robert had experienced an acute psychotic episode on Monday night, becoming violent and attacking an orderly, though she seemed confused when I asked for details about which orderly and what exactly had happened. Dr. Brennan had authorized an emergency procedure, a transorbital lobotomy, performed Tuesday afternoon by a visiting surgeon whose name wasn't in any of our staff directories. When I frantically searched for my report in the hospital's digital system, it was gone, not even in the deletion records. My key card no longer opened the archive room, and when I tried to log into my account from home that evening, my credentials had been revoked. Dr. Brennan left me a voicemail saying my internship was being terminated due to breach of patient confidentiality protocols, and that I should return my badge by Friday. I couldn't just walk away. Thursday night, I convinced Jamal, an orderly who'd always been friendly with me, to meet me at a diner off Route 47. He was nervous, kept checking the parking lot through the window, but after 3 cups of coffee and my promise that I'd never mention his name, he told me what he knew. There had been no violent episode Monday night. Robert had been sedated right after dinner, taken directly to the medical wing. Jamal had seen 2 men in suits wheeling Robert's gurney, men he'd never seen before who had visitor badges but somehow had keys to the restricted areas. More disturbing, Jamal mentioned that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Over his 8 years at Riverside, he'd seen at least 4 other patients who'd been trying to appeal their cases suddenly have episodes requiring immediate surgical intervention. Always when Dr. Brennan was conveniently away or occupied, always with visiting surgeons who vanished afterward, always with paperwork that somehow got filed incorrectly or lost entirely. The next morning, I drove back to the hospital one last time, not to return my badge, but to see Robert. Security tried to stop me, but I told them I'd left personal items in my desk and had Dr. Brennan's permission, a lie that bought me maybe 10 minutes. I found Robert in the day room, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his eyes vacant and unfocused. The precise, articulate man who'd fought for 11 years to prove his innocence was gone. When I knelt beside him and said his name, he turned toward me slowly. a bit of recognition flickering somewhere deep behind his eyes. "Catherine," he whispered, and then nothing more. On my way out, I passed Dr. Brennan in the hallway, and he stopped me with a hand on my shoulder, his grip just a bit too firm. "Some patients," he said quietly, "are here because the system knows exactly where they belong. It's unfortunate when young idealists don't understand the bigger picture. I trust you'll be discreet about your time here, for your own career's sake." I spent weeks trying to find someone who would listen. Legal aid organizations, journalism departments at universities, even the ACLU. But without the original documents, without access to Robert's files, I had nothing but my word against a respected state institution. The cassette tape I'd listened to supposedly never existed, according to official records. The copy shop where I'd made duplicates had a convenient fire in their storage room 2 days after my visit, destroying their security footage and machine records. 3 months later, I received a letter from the state licensing board saying they'd received a complaint about my unprofessional conduct during my internship, and that any attempt to pursue psychiatric credentials would be subject to extensive review. I took a job in medical billing, as far from patient care as I could get, but I kept every note I'd made, every screenshot I'd managed to take before my access was revoked. Everything stored in multiple cloud accounts under different names. Last month, 5 years after that nightmare at Riverside, I got an unexpected email from Jamal. Robert had died of pneumonia in the hospital ward, forgotten and silent to the end. But Jamal had something else to tell me. Beverly, the charge nurse, was retiring and had been cleaning out old files from her personal cabinet. She'd found something wedged behind a drawer, something that must have fallen back there years ago. A partial photocopy of Dr. Cross's original session notes with Robert, handwritten observations that never made it into the official transcript. In the margins, Cross had written, "Subject resistant to suggestion, increased sodium pentothal dosage. Narrative implanted successfully after 3rd attempt. Client satisfied with results." Below that, a phone number with a note. "Contact H. Brennan for remaining payment." Beverly was scared, didn't want trouble, but she'd given the paper to Jamal before destroying it. He sent me a photo before burning it himself, too afraid to keep evidence. I still have that photo, encrypted and hidden. The only proof that Robert Garrison spent 11 years in a psychiatric hospital for a murder someone else committed, lobotomized not for violence, but for refusing to stop proclaiming his innocence. Sometimes I wonder how many others are sitting in institutions right now, their truths dissolved by chemicals and scalpels, their stories buried in basement archives that no one will ever search. I never thought I'd be writing about Kyle here, but after what the police showed me last week, I need to get this out there. Maybe someone can make sense of it, because I sure can't. Kyle Brenner was my roommate for 2 years while we both attended film school in Boston. He dropped out in 2022 to focus on his YouTube channel, paranormal investigations, urban exploration, that kind of content. The guy was obsessed with abandoned places, especially ones with dark histories. He'd spend hours researching locations, digging through old newspaper archives, tracking down former employees or patients. His channel had around 40,000 subscribers. Nothing huge, but enough that he was making decent money from sponsors and memberships. That night in early December, he told me he'd found the perfect location for his biggest live stream yet, some abandoned psychiatric hospital about 3 hours north of the city. The place was called Whitmore State Hospital, and Kyle had been researching it for months. Over dinner that week, he couldn't stop talking about what he'd uncovered. The hospital operated from 1923 to 1986, but what made it notorious were the experimental procedures they performed in the 1940s. Apparently, some doctor named Clarence Whitmore, yeah, they named it after him, had been performing lobotomies before they were even officially approved. But these weren't just regular lobotomies. Kyle showed me these photocopies of old medical journals where other doctors had criticized Whitmore's techniques as unnecessarily invasive and ethically questionable, which in 1940s medical speak probably meant absolutely horrifying. The state shut down that whole wing in 1947 after several patients died, but the hospital kept operating for another 40 years. Kyle had this whole folder of documentation, including building blueprints he'd somehow gotten from a contact at the county records office. The night of December 8th, Kyle set up his streaming equipment in our living room for a final check before heading out. He had 2 cameras, his main DSLR and a backup GoPro strapped to his chest, plus 3 different flashlights, backup batteries, and his phone as a mobile hotspot for the stream. I remember him adjusting the settings on his laptop, making sure the stream quality would hold up even with a weak signal. He'd promoted this live stream for weeks on his channel, calling it the Whitmore Investigation, live and unfiltered. By the time he went live at 9 p.m., there were already about 3,000 people waiting in the chat. I watched the first few minutes from my room. Kyle was in his car, driving through this thick fog, explaining the history of the place to his viewers. He mentioned that the surgical wing where Whitmore did his experiments had been sealed since 1947, but he'd found a maintenance tunnel that might lead inside. The chat was going crazy with excitement, people sending donations, asking him to check specific rooms. I actually fell asleep around 10:30 that night, while Kyle was still streaming. From what I've pieced together from the archived footage and chat logs the police showed me, he reached the hospital around 10:15. The building looked exactly like you'd expect. Broken windows, graffiti everywhere, vines crawling up the brick walls. Kyle spent about 20 minutes just walking around the outside, showing his viewers the different wings, reading old signs that were barely visible in the darkness. The main entrance had been boarded up, but he found a side door that had been pried open, probably by other urban explorers or vandals. The first floor was mostly administrative offices, nothing too interesting except for some old patient files scattered around that he didn't touch, saying something about respecting privacy even decades later. It was when he found the stairwell to the basement that things started getting weird. The chat logs show that around 11 p.m., viewers started commenting that they were hearing something in the background of his audio, like a low humming or droning sound that Kyle apparently couldn't hear through his earbuds. The basement was where the old surgical wing connected to the main building. Kyle's flashlight kept catching these long shadows down the corridors, and the walls were lined with those old mint green tiles that hospitals used back then, most of them cracked or fallen off completely. According to the stream footage, he spent about 15 minutes navigating through what looked like a maze of hallways, following his blueprint by the light of his phone screen. The chat was getting more and more agitated. People kept saying they were seeing something moving in the peripheral edges of his camera frame, always just out of direct view. One user, Brooklyn Ghost 22, typed in all caps that there was definitely someone else down there with him. Kyle either wasn't reading the chat or was ignoring it for dramatic effect. He kept narrating what he was seeing: old gurneys pushed against walls, rooms with rusted bed frames, a nurse's station with medication logs still sitting on the desk from 1986. Then he found it, a heavy metal door with Surgical Suite B stamped on a brass plate. The door had been chained shut, but the chain was old and rusted. Kyle pulled out a crowbar from his backpack. The timestamp on the video shows 11:47 p.m. when Kyle finally got the chain off. The door scraped against the floor as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through his microphone and making several viewers comment that it sounded like screaming. Inside, the surgical room was bizarrely well preserved. There was this operating table in the center, still with its leather straps hanging down, and cabinets along the walls filled with old medical instruments. Kyle panned his camera slowly across the room, and that's when it happened, when everyone saw it. In the corner behind a tall medical cabinet with glass doors, there was clear movement. Not like a shadow or a trick of the light, but something solid ducking out of view. The chat exploded. People were typing, "Get out," and "behind the cabinet" so fast the messages were just a blur on the screen. Kyle walked closer to investigate, saying something about it probably being a raccoon or another explorer. His camera was focused on the cabinet when viewers started screaming in the chat about his chest cam footage. The GoPro was picking up something his main camera wasn't. In that footage, which the police enhanced and showed me, you can see what looks like fingers gripping the edge of another cabinet about 10 feet to Kyle's left, like someone was peering around it. Kyle never saw those fingers. He was completely focused on the first cabinet, pulling it away from the wall to check behind it. When he did, there was nothing there except old water damage and peeling paint. But the chat was going absolutely insane. The viewer count had jumped to almost 8,000 people, and donations were pouring in with messages begging him to leave immediately. Someone donated $50 with the message, "Please just run now." Kyle finally glanced at his phone to check the chat, and you could see him pause, probably reading all the warnings. He actually laughed more, and said something like, "Come on guys, you're letting your imagination get the best of you. It's just an old building." That's when he decided to explore the adjoining room through a doorway on the far side of the surgical suite. The doorway led to what looked like a prep room, with old sinks and metal tables. As he walked through, his main camera started getting this weird interference. These horizontal lines rolling up the screen every few seconds. Kyle blamed it on the old electrical wiring possibly still having some residual charge, which made no sense, but he kept going. The prep room connected to a narrow hallway with 3 doors. Kyle tried the first 2, both locked solid, wouldn't budge even with his crowbar. The third door was slightly ajar. The timestamp shows 12:14 a.m. when he pushed it open. Inside was what Kyle identified as Whitmore's personal office, based on a nameplate still sitting on the desk. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets along one wall. There were papers everywhere, like someone had dumped out all the files decades ago. Kyle set his main camera on the desk to get a wide shot while he looked through some of the papers with his flashlight. That's when the stream started getting really strange. The viewers could see Kyle examining documents, but behind him, in the doorway he'd just come through, there was a shadow that didn't match anything in the room. The shadow would appear for a few seconds, then disappear, then reappear slightly closer. One viewer managed to screenshot it and enhance the image. They said it looked like someone in old medical scrubs standing perfectly still. But here's the truly disturbing part. Kyle's voice started echoing. Not like a normal echo in an empty room, but his words from earlier in the stream were repeating faintly in the background. Viewers could hear him saying, "Just an old building," over and over, getting slightly louder each time. At 12:31 a.m., Kyle picked up his camera from the desk and turned around to leave the office. The doorway was empty, nothing blocking his path. But when he stepped into the hallway, his flashlight died, just went completely black. The camera's night vision kicked in, showing everything in that greenish-gray tint, and that's when viewers saw what Kyle couldn't see in the darkness. There were people in the hallway, not one person, but 3 or 4 figures standing completely motionless at different points along the corridor. They were all facing the walls, their heads pressed against them like children being punished. Kyle pulled out his backup flashlight, and the second the beam hit the hallway, the figures were gone. Not like they ran away. The video shows they just weren't there anymore the instant the light touched where they'd been standing. Kyle muttered something about the night vision playing tricks, but his voice was shaking now. He started walking faster, trying to retrace his steps back to the surgical suite. The chat was in complete chaos. People were begging him to call the police, to get out any way he could. The viewer count had hit 12,000. Someone kept spamming "They're following you" over and over. Kyle made it back to the surgical suite, but something was wrong with the room. In the stream footage, viewers could see that all the medical instruments in the cabinets had been rearranged. What had been random placement before was now organized into perfect rows, all the sharp edges pointing outward toward the center of the room. Kyle didn't notice or didn't comment on it. He was focused on getting back to the basement corridor. But as he crossed the room, his GoPro picked up audio that the main camera missed. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing that seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. The enhanced audio the police played for me was even worse. Underneath the breathing, you could hear what sounded like metal scraping against tile, like something being dragged. Kyle reached the door to the main basement corridor at 12:43 a.m. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't open. Not locked. The handle turned fine, but it was like something was holding it shut from the other side. Kyle put the camera down and used both hands, really yanking on it. The chat feed shows viewers screaming at him to look behind him. In his camera view, that operating table in the center of the room. Its leather straps were now standing straight up, defying gravity, reaching toward the ceiling like fingers. That's when the stream started cutting out. The video would freeze for a second, go to static, then come back. Each time it returned, Kyle seemed to be in a slightly different position in the room, like frames were missing. In one return, he was at the door. Next, he was back by the operating table, then by the cabinets. He didn't seem aware of these jumps. He kept talking as if nothing was happening, still trying to get the door open. But his words weren't matching his mouth movements anymore. The audio was delayed, or maybe it was from earlier, viewers couldn't tell. At 12:51 a.m., the stream stabilized for about 30 seconds. Kyle had given up on the door and was trying to smash through the glass of one of the windows high up on the wall. He'd stacked 2 gurneys and was standing on them, hitting the glass with his crowbar. The chat shows multiple people pointing out that his shadow on the wall had too many arms. The enhanced footage confirms it. His shadow showed 4 arms instead of 2, with the extra ones hanging limp at wrong angles. Then viewers heard Kyle's voice, clear as day, saying, "Don't turn off the light. Don't turn off the light." But his mouth wasn't moving. He was still smashing at the window, completely silent except for the impact sounds, while his voice repeated that phrase over and over from somewhere else in the room. At exactly 1 a.m., everything went white. Not static, not black, pure white. The stream stayed that way for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The chat was still active, thousands of people typing, asking what happened, begging for Kyle to respond. Then, at 1:04:17 a.m., the video came back for exactly 3 seconds. It showed Kyle's face in extreme close-up, like he was holding the camera right against his chin. His eyes were wide open, but looking at something above the camera, not at the lens. His mouth was moving rapidly, like he was speaking incredibly fast, but the only audio was that same phrase, "Don't turn off the light." The stream ended there, just cut to nothing. The chat stayed active for hours, people trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. Someone called the Boston Police Department around 2 a.m. They said they couldn't do anything since Kyle was streaming from New Hampshire, so they contacted state police up there. It took them 3 days to find the hospital. Kyle had been careful not to reveal the exact location during his stream, to avoid getting in trouble for trespassing. When the police finally got to Whitmore State Hospital on December 11th, they found Kyle's car still parked outside, covered in frost. His streaming equipment was discovered in that same surgical suite, the camera still recording somehow, despite the battery supposedly only lasting 4 hours max. The memory card had 43 hours of footage on it. Impossible, since the card could only hold 16 hours. Most of it was just the empty room, but every few hours, you could hear Kyle's voice faintly saying that same phrase about the light. The really disturbing part was what they found when they checked the timestamp data. According to the camera's internal clock, it had been recording continuously since December 8th, but it showed dates jumping randomly, sometimes showing December 2022, sometimes March 1947, sometimes dates that hadn't happened yet. The police tech guy said it was probably a malfunction, but he'd never seen anything like it. They found Kyle's phone in the basement corridor, the screen cracked, but still functional. His streaming app was still open, showing 0 viewers and a stream duration of -17 hours, whatever that means. His backpack was in Whitmore's office, everything neatly arranged inside like he'd carefully packed it to leave. But Kyle himself was nowhere in the building. Here's where it gets worse and why I'm writing this. 5 days after they found his equipment, Kyle walked into a gas station in Concord, about 60 miles from the hospital. The security footage shows him entering at 3:47 a.m., walking straight to the counter, and asking the clerk to call someone for him. The clerk said Kyle couldn't remember his own phone number, couldn't remember how he'd gotten there, but kept insisting someone needed to turn the light back on at the hospital. The police picked him up, and he's been in psychiatric care since then. I visited him twice. The first time, he didn't recognize me at all, just kept drawing these detailed floor plans of the hospital on any paper he could find. The second time, last week, he grabbed my arm and said my name for the first time since they found him. He told me he remembered everything from that night, that he'd found more than just abandoned rooms in that basement. He said there were people still there, still working, still performing procedures. Not ghosts or whatever. Actual people who'd never left when the hospital closed. He said they've been living in sections of the building that aren't on any blueprint, spaces between the walls, continuing Whitmore's work. The doctors think it's trauma-induced psychosis. But Kyle gave me coordinates, specific measurements of where these hidden spaces are. I haven't told anyone else this, but I drove up there yesterday just to look from outside. The building's been completely demolished. Nothing left but an empty lot. The demolition order was dated December 7th, the day before Kyle's stream. The company that did it has no record of the job. The old Greystone State Hospital had been shuttered since 1987, but in March of 2016, I managed to get permission to spend 3 nights there for a documentary I was putting together about psychiatric institutions in the 1950s. At that point in my life, freelancing was barely paying my rent in Portland, and my apartment was basically a storage unit for old medical journals and declassified government documents. I'd been chasing stories like this since my 20s, and now, more than a decade into this career, I'd learned that the darker the history, the more people wanted to watch. I'd spent 6 months researching Greystone specifically because of the electroshock experiments they'd conducted there. Dr. Edmund Farrow had run a program that supposedly helped schizophrenic patients through intensive electrical therapy sessions, though most of his records had mysteriously disappeared after a patient named Dorothy Vance died under questionable circumstances in 1958. I arrived at Greystone on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 duffel bags full of recording equipment, 5 digital voice recorders, a camcorder, extra batteries, and enough protein bars to last me through the weekend. The building looked exactly like you'd expect an abandoned asylum to look, all peeling paint and broken windows, except for the electroshock ward on the 2nd floor, which had been preserved almost perfectly. Room 213 was where they'd done the actual procedures, and walking in there felt like stepping into a photograph from 60 years ago. The leather restraint chair was still bolted to the floor, the electrical panels still had their original dials and switches, and there was this observation window that looked in from the hallway, though someone had sealed it with industrial-grade adhesive at some point. My plan was simple enough: set up the recorders in different spots around the ward, let them run overnight and hopefully capture some ambient sound that would add atmosphere to the documentary. I placed one recorder on the metal tray table next to the restraint chair, another on the windowsill overlooking the courtyard, a third in the hallway just outside room 213, and the fourth near the old nurse's station. The 5th one I kept with me as backup. While I was setting everything up, I noticed something odd about the observation room behind that sealed window. There were scratch marks on the inside of the glass, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. The adhesive was yellowed with age but still solid, and according to the maintenance logs I'd found, that room had been sealed in 1959, right after Dorothy Vance's death. That first night I slept in what used to be the doctor's lounge down the hall, far enough from the electroshock ward that I wouldn't hear every little creak and groan of the old building. Around 2 a.m. I woke up because I thought I heard footsteps above me, but the third floor had collapsed years ago. There was literally nothing up there but exposed beams and pigeons. I checked my phone and saw that the recorders were still running, their little red lights blinking in the darkness when I peeked down the hallway. The building had this particular smell, like wet newspaper mixed with something medicinal that had soaked into the walls over decades. I went back to sleep telling myself that abandoned buildings make all kinds of noises, especially ones with this much history bleeding through the cracks. The next morning, I went to collect the recorders, eager to see if I'd captured anything useful. The first 3 were exactly where I'd left them, but when I got to the nurse's station, that recorder was on the floor, not on the desk where I'd placed it. The device was still recording, and when I picked it up, I noticed the battery was almost dead, even though I'd put in fresh ones the night before. I gathered all 4 devices and sat in the lounge with my laptop, transferring the audio files. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: settling wood, wind through broken windows, maybe some rats in the walls. But when I got to the recording from the device in room 213, the one on the metal tray table, I heard something that made me stop the playback and rewind. At 3:47 a.m., there was a woman's voice barely above a whisper reciting names: Dorothy Vance, Franklin Hewitt, Margaret Russo, Anthony Carmine. I recognized some of these from my research. They were all patients who'd undergone Dr. Farrow's experimental treatments between 1954 and 1958. The voice continued for about 2 minutes, listing maybe 15 or 16 names total. And then, at the very end, clear as day, she said my name: Brian Novak. The thing is, I'd never published under my real name, always used pseudonyms for my articles, and I definitely hadn't mentioned it to anyone at Greystone or even to the caretaker who'd let me in. The voice had this quality to it, like someone speaking through water or from very far away, but the names were unmistakably clear, especially mine. I played it back 3 more times, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe someone was playing a prank, but who would know those specific patient names? The historical records I'd found were scattered across different archives, some only available through Freedom of Information Act requests. I checked the other recordings from that same time frame, and they all had the usual ambient noise except for one detail. On the hallway recorder, about 5 minutes before the voice started listing names, there was the sound of a door opening. Not creaking or being forced, but opening normally, like someone with a key. The nurse's station recording, the one from the device I'd found on the floor, had captured something else entirely: rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on metal, that went on for nearly an hour, starting at exactly 3:42 a.m. I spent the rest of that day going through the hospital's old employee records that I'd photocopied from the state archives. There was no mention of any female staff member who'd worked closely with Dr. Farrow during those experiments, just 2 male orderlies and a male nurse named Christopher Dalton. But in the margins of one report from 1958, someone had penciled in a note: Mrs. F knows about the recordings in 213. Mrs. F. Could that have been Farrow's wife? I searched for any mention of her in the documents, but found nothing. The daylight was starting to fade, and I had to decide whether to pack up and leave or stay for the second night. I'd driven 4 hours to get here, had permission for 3 nights, and honestly, I needed this footage for my documentary. Against every instinct telling me to get out, I decided to stay and set up the recorders again, this time adding my backup 5th recorder inside room 213, right on the seat of the restraint chair. That second night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat in the doctor's lounge with my laptop, reviewing more of the audio from the first night and cross-referencing patient names with the hospital's admission records. Around 1 a.m., I heard actual footsteps in the hallway, not above me this time, but on the same floor, moving slowly toward the electroshock ward. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check, but the hallway was empty. The recorders were still in place, their red lights creating tiny dots in the darkness. When I shined my light into room 213, the fifth recorder, the one I'd placed on the restraint chair, was now on the floor, face down. I know I'd secured it with gaffer tape because I didn't want it falling off during the night. The tape was still on the chair, torn cleanly down the middle like someone had pulled the device straight through it. I picked up the recorder and checked it. Still running, but the display showed it had been recording for 7 hours, which was impossible since I'd only set it up 2 hours ago. The timestamp on the device had somehow jumped backward to the previous night. I was trying to make sense of this when I heard something that made me drop the recorder, a woman humming from inside the sealed observation room. Not a recording, not an echo, but actual humming coming from behind that adhesive-covered window. I put my ear against the sealed glass and could hear it more clearly. A lullaby. Something familiar but wrong, like the notes were slightly off-key. Then the humming stopped, and I heard breathing slow and deliberate, as if someone had their mouth pressed against the other side of the glass, exactly where my ear was. I jerked away from the window and ran back to the lounge, grabbing my equipment. I wasn't staying another minute in that place. As I threw everything into my bags, I realized one of the recorders was missing. The one from the metal tray table in room 213, the same one that had captured the woman's voice listing names the night before. I knew I should just leave it, but those devices cost $300 each, and I needed it. I went back to room 213 one last time, using my phone's flashlight since I'd already packed my good one. The recorder wasn't on the tray table, wasn't on the floor, wasn't anywhere in the room. But when I turned to leave, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The adhesive seal on the observation window had been peeled back at one corner, just enough for someone to squeeze their fingers through. Fresh adhesive was dripping down the wall like honey. The next morning, after driving straight home without stopping, I got a call from the caretaker at Greystone. He said the state police had been called to the hospital because someone had broken into the sealed observation room. They'd found my missing recorder inside, along with my fingerprints on the interior walls and door handle. The thing is, that room had been sealed since 1959, and when they checked their records, they found that it had been sealed from the inside, not the outside. The caretaker said they also found something else in there, a box of old recordings, reel-to-reel tapes from the 1950s, each one labeled with a patient name. The last tape in the box had my name on it, written in pencil, and when they played it, it was 47 minutes of my own voice describing electroshock procedures I'd never researched, using medical terminology I didn't know, speaking as if I was Dr. Farrow himself, conducting a session on a patient named Brian Novak. The police wanted me to come in for questioning, but what could I tell them? That I'd never been inside that room. The fingerprint evidence said otherwise. My lawyer advised me to claim someone had lifted my prints and planted them, but even she didn't believe that explanation. The investigation went on for months, and during that time, I did my own research into Dr. Farrow's wife. Turns out her name was Frances, and she'd been a patient at Greystone before marrying Edmund Farrow in 1952. She'd been admitted for hysteria and auditory hallucinations. She claimed she could hear the thoughts of people who hadn't been born yet. The staff notes described her as unusually fixated on recording devices, and mentioned that she would spend hours talking into empty rooms, claiming she was leaving messages for the documentary maker. Frances Farrow died in 1959, the same year they sealed the observation room, apparently from a self-inflicted electrical burn sustained while trying to operate her husband's equipment alone. I never finished the documentary. The footage I shot at Greystone sits in a box in my closet, unwatched since that night. Sometimes I wonder if I should destroy it all, but I can't bring myself to do it. Last month I got a package with no return address. Inside was one of my recorders, the one the police said they'd kept as evidence. It had a recording on it dated from next year, April 2017, and it's my voice again, except I'm 70 years old in it, describing my treatment at Greystone and thanking Dr. Farrow for curing my temporal displacement disorder. The recording is 3 hours long, and at the end, I can hear that same woman's voice from the first night, except now I recognize it. It's Frances Farrow, and she's saying, "Session complete. Patient Brian Novak, admitted March 2016, discharged April 1959. Riverside Memorial's West Wing had broken air conditioning that late summer of 2015, making 12-hour shifts feel like an eternity in that psychiatric unit. After 11 years as a nurse there, most cases blurred together, but Natalie Foster stood out from the moment her husband Tom brought her through those doors. She was 34, had designed award-winning buildings before her breakdown, and Tom found her sitting in their bathtub, fully clothed, insisting she needed to practice being in a coffin. The intake paperwork listed severe dissociative disorder with depersonalization, but those clinical terms didn't capture the absolute conviction in her eyes when she told me during that first assessment that she had died in a car accident 3 years prior and was just a ghost pretending to be alive. She spoke about it so matter-of-factly, like explaining that the sky was blue or water was wet, and even showed me newspaper clippings she carried in her purse about various car accidents, pointing to random victims and claiming those were about her death. Dr. Warren Steinberg had been treating Natalie for 2 months when he proposed the exposure therapy that would change everything. That staff meeting still haunts me. The fluorescent lights humming overhead, the bitter taste of break room coffee, and the way my supervisor Karen kept clicking her pen nervously as Steinberg outlined his plan. He wanted to take Natalie down to the hospital morgue, let her see actual deceased bodies, force her to confront the difference between death and her current state. The theory sounded almost reasonable when he explained it with his charts and studies, talking about radical exposure therapy and breakthrough cases from some research hospital in Phoenix. But something in my gut twisted hard when he mentioned she'd need to spend extended periods there, not just minutes but hours at a time. 3 sessions per week minimum. Karen asked about ethics approval, and Steinberg produced a thick folder of paperwork, signatures from the board, consent forms that Tom had signed with tears streaming down his face, desperate to get his wife back to who she used to be. The first session happened on a Monday morning, and they assigned me to accompany them since Natalie trusted me more than the other nurses. The morgue was in the basement, past the loading docks where they brought supplies, down a long hallway with pipes running along the ceiling that dripped condensation onto the cracked linoleum floor. Dr. Coleman, the chief medical examiner, met us at the entrance wearing that perpetual frown he always had, clearly uncomfortable with the whole arrangement but bound by whatever agreement Steinberg had made with administration. Natalie walked between us like she was heading to a regular therapy appointment, even humming softly under her breath, some melody that sounded like a lullaby played backward. When Coleman opened the heavy metal door and that wave of cold, preservative-scented air hit us, Natalie actually smiled and said it felt like coming home. The room had 8 steel tables, 3 occupied by bodies covered in white sheets, and the fluorescent lights gave everything this bluish tinge that made even us living people look somewhat corpse-like. Steinberg instructed Natalie to sit in a chair he'd placed between 2 of the occupied tables, close enough that she could reach out and touch the sheets if she wanted. The first hour, she just sat there perfectly still, barely blinking while Steinberg took notes on his clipboard and asked her questions about what she was experiencing. She answered in this dreamy, disconnected voice, describing how familiar everything felt, how the bodies under the sheets were just like her, caught between worlds, pretending to be something they weren't. Around the 90-minute mark, she started having conversations with the covered corpses, not in a crazy, yelling way, but quiet, intimate whispers like she was sharing secrets with old friends. Steinberg seemed thrilled, scribbling faster in his notebook, muttering about breakthrough responses and cognitive dissonance markers. But watching Natalie lean toward that sheet-covered form, whispering earnestly to whoever she thought was listening underneath, made my stomach churn in a way that had nothing to do with the preserved flesh smell permeating that room. By the 3rd week, Natalie had stopped eating regular meals, claiming dead people didn't need food, only surviving on the protein shakes Tom forced her to drink during his visits. The sessions had extended to 3 hours each, and Steinberg had gotten permission to leave her alone in the morgue for portions of that time, observing through a security camera while he reviewed notes upstairs. During one session in early September, while I waited outside the morgue doors on my break, I heard Natalie through the ventilation grate, not talking this time, but making these wet, rhythmic sounds like someone learning to breathe underwater. When I rushed inside, I found her pressing her face against one of the body bags that had arrived that morning, inhaling deeply through the plastic. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She told Steinberg later that she was trying to remember what death smelled like, trying to match her own scent to theirs. And he actually wrote this down like it was some kind of therapeutic breakthrough instead of a woman literally huffing corpse fumes through plastic. The changes in Natalie accelerated after that incident, transforming her from a confused but functional person into something else entirely. Her skin took on this grayish pallor that wasn't quite medical, but wasn't quite right either, and she started moving differently. These slow, deliberate gestures like she was underwater or operating her body by remote control. Tom stopped visiting after she told him he was talking to an echo, that the real Natalie was downstairs in drawer number 7, waiting to be properly buried. The other patients in the ward started avoiding her, claiming she smelled like formaldehyde even though she showered twice daily, scrubbing her skin until it was raw and bleeding in places. But Steinberg kept pushing forward with his sessions, now up to 4 hours at a time, bringing in fresh corpses for her to sit with, documenting her reactions as she traced her fingers along their cold faces, whispering questions none of us could quite make out, but that seemed to get answers only she could hear. The night everything fell apart started with a call from Coleman around 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in late September. Security had found the morgue door propped open with a wheelchair, and when they checked inside, they discovered Natalie had somehow gotten out of the locked ward and made her way down there alone. They found her lying on one of the empty steel tables, arms crossed over her chest, not breathing, or rather taking breaths so shallow that the security guard initially thought she was actually dead. When they tried to move her, she went rigid, every muscle locked in place like rigor mortis had set in, and it took 4 of us plus 2 orderlies to get her onto a gurney. The strangest part was her temperature, 76 degrees Fahrenheit when we finally got a reading, cold enough that she should have been in severe hypothermia, but her heart was still beating steady at 40 beats per minute. Steinberg arrived within the hour, furious about the security breach but fascinated by her condition, ordering warming blankets while simultaneously documenting what he called a death state achievement in his notes. For the next 2 days, Natalie remained in that state, cold, rigid, barely breathing but somehow still alive. She wouldn't respond to anyone, not even pain stimuli, just lay there with her eyes open but unfocused, pupils dilated so wide her brown irises looked black. Then on Friday afternoon, she suddenly sat up, turned to look directly at the empty space beside her bed, and started having a full conversation with someone who wasn't there. Not the confused rambling of psychosis, but actual back-and-forth dialogue, pausing to listen, nodding at responses, even laughing at something her invisible companion apparently said. She talked about the morgue like it was a waiting room, described the bodies as travelers preparing for a journey, and mentioned that the woman in drawer 7, the one she'd claimed was the real Natalie, had been teaching her things. When Karen asked what kinds of things, Natalie just smiled this serene, empty smile and said we wouldn't understand because we were still pretending to be alive, still playing the game of warmth and breath and heartbeat. After that incident, the hospital administration finally stepped in and terminated Steinberg's experimental treatment. But the damage was already done. Natalie had gone completely silent by early November, wouldn't speak to anyone. Not the new psychiatrist they brought in, not the nurses, not even Tom when he tried one last visit before filing for divorce. She would just sit in her room, positioned in the exact same spot every day, facing the corner where the walls met, moving her lips constantly like she was having conversations we couldn't hear. The new doctor, A woman named Dr. Lisa Thornton from Johns Hopkins tried everything: antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, even electroconvulsive therapy with the family's consent. But nothing brought Natalie back from wherever she'd gone. The only time she showed any awareness of her surroundings was when they had to wheel her past the basement level in the elevator for medical tests. She would press her hands against the elevator walls and lean toward the doors, her whole body straining toward the morgue like a plant bending toward sunlight. 6 months later, in May of 2016, the call came during my morning shift. The night nurse, a new hire named Dennis who didn't know Natalie's full history, had found her missing from her room at the 4 a.m. check. Security footage showed her walking calmly out of the ward at 3:17 a.m. Somehow the door that was supposed to be locked had been left open by a maintenance worker fixing the air conditioning. They found her in the morgue, of course, sitting on the floor beside gurney number 7, the one she'd always claimed held the real Natalie. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. She wasn't alone down there. Or at least she was having a complete two-sided conversation with someone. And when they reviewed the security footage later, they could see her clearly responding to something, looking at a specific spot next to her, even reaching out to touch something that wasn't there. The audio picked up her side of the conversation perfectly, talking about finally being ready, about understanding what comes next, about how the waiting was over. When they tried to get Natalie to stand up and leave the morgue, she went into that rigid state again, but this time it was different. Her body temperature read 68 degrees, and her pulse was barely detectable, maybe 20 beats per minute. Dr. Thornton made the decision to let her stay there while they monitored her vitals, thinking that forcing her to leave might cause complete cardiac arrest. For 3 hours, Natalie sat beside that empty gurney, occasionally nodding, sometimes smiling, her lips moving in constant conversation with whoever she believed was there. Then at 7:23 a.m., she suddenly stood up, walked to the middle of the room, and announced in a clear, strong voice, the first word she'd spoken in months, that she understood now, that the woman in drawer 7 had explained everything, that dying wasn't about stopping but about transitioning, and that she'd been doing it wrong by trying to force it. She said she needed to wait for her appointment, that everyone had one, and hers was coming soon. Before anyone could respond, she walked calmly back to the psychiatric ward with us, allowed herself to be admitted to her room, and sat in her usual corner spot, returning to her silent state. That was 8 years ago, and Natalie is still there in that same ward, in that same corner, having those same silent conversations with someone only she can see. She's become something of a legend among the staff, the patient who spent so much time with the dead that she forgot how to be alive. New nurses always ask about her, especially when they notice how she never seems to age quite right, how her skin maintains that slightly gray pallor no matter how much sunlight she gets during outdoor therapy, how her body temperature never quite reaches normal. Dr. Thornton left after 2 years, said she couldn't explain what happened to Natalie medically or psychiatrically. Steinberg lost his license after an investigation revealed he'd falsified some of his research data, though he still writes papers about Natalie's case from his retirement in Florida. And me? I transferred to pediatric care after that last incident. Couldn't handle walking past that basement entrance every day, knowing what happened down there. But sometimes when I work night shifts and pass by the psychiatric ward, I wonder if Natalie is still sitting in that corner, still whispering to her invisible companion, still waiting for that appointment she mentioned. And what exactly will happen when it finally arrives? That summer of 1982 changed everything about how I see psychiatric care. Pinewood Behavioral Center sat in rural Pennsylvania, 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless cornfields and gravel roads that turned into thick mud whenever storm clouds rolled through. I'd been working there for about 3 months as a nurse. At 23, it was my first real job after finishing school. Most of the staff lived on site in converted dormitories from when the building served as a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 40s. The isolation wing where I worked had 12 padded rooms, though we rarely used more than 3 or 4 at a time. My supervisor, a woman named Judith with steel gray hair and a perpetual coffee stain on her scrubs, told me during my first week that the isolation rooms were a last resort, only for patients who posed immediate danger to themselves or others. I believed her then, trusted the system, trusted that everything we did was for the patient's benefit. The patient they called Jimmy, though his real name was James Whitfield, had been with us for 6 months when everything went wrong. He was 31, diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder, and had these episodes where he'd pace the halls for hours muttering numbers in sequences that never repeated. He wasn't violent, just confused most days, always asking about his sister who died in a car accident 5 years before his admission. On that Friday afternoon in August, Jimmy had gotten agitated during group therapy when another patient started screaming about seeing bugs crawling under his skin. The charge nurse, a guy named Carl who always smelled like menthol cigarettes and had worked there since the 60s, decided Jimmy needed time in isolation to calm down. I remember thinking it was excessive. Jimmy was just scared, covering his ears and rocking in his chair. But Carl outranked me, and questioning senior staff wasn't something a new nurse did if she wanted to keep her job. The storm hit around 7 that evening, just as I was helping Carl escort Jimmy to room 9 in the isolation wing. The hallway lights flickered while we walked, and Jimmy kept stopping every few steps, pressing his palms flat against the walls like he was trying to feel for vibrations. "The numbers are wrong today," he kept saying, his voice barely above a whisper. 7, 14, 21, but then it skips to 23. Why does it skip? Carl just grabbed his arm harder, practically dragging him the last few feet. Room 9 had padding that went up 8 feet on every wall, yellowed foam that had absorbed decades of sweat and fear and God knows what else. The observation window in the door was reinforced with wire mesh, and there was a single overhead light protected by a metal cage. Protocol said we had to remove Jimmy's shoes, belt, and anything else he could use to hurt himself. He cooperated, even folded his clothes neatly and handed them to me. But his eyes never left that caged light fixture. By 8:30, the storm had knocked out half the county's power grid, and our backup generators kicked in with a grinding mechanical wheeze that echoed through the whole building. I was doing rounds in the main ward when the lights went completely dark for about 10 seconds. Not just dim, but absolute blackness that made you lose all sense of where you were standing. When the emergency power finally stabilized, only about half the lights came back on, casting these long, distorted shadows down every corridor. The administrator, Mr. Donovan, called an emergency meeting in the cafeteria. He had this thin mustache he was always touching when he got nervous, and that night, he couldn't stop fidgeting with it. "We're running on limited power until morning," he announced to the skeleton crew of maybe 15 staff members. "Priority goes to the medical wing, the pharmacy, and the main nurses' stations. Non-essential areas will remain dark." Someone asked about the isolation wing, and Donovan waved his hand dismissively. "Those rooms are secure. The patients there will be fine until morning. We'll resume normal protocols once power is restored." I tried to speak up, told him we had Jimmy in room 9 who'd just been admitted to isolation that afternoon, but Donovan cut me off. "The isolation wing has been used for decades without power," he said, that condescending tone creeping into his voice. "Those rooms are designed to be safe even in complete darkness. No one can hurt themselves in there." Carl backed him up, mentioned how in the old days before proper electrical systems, they'd keep patients in those rooms for days with just candlelight in the hallways. But something gnawed at me. The way Jimmy had stared at that caged light, the way he'd been counting, always counting. Around midnight, I tried to go check on him anyway, but the corridor to the isolation wing was pitch black, and my flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet into that thick darkness. The emergency exits at both ends of the wing had been sealed with chains and padlocks years ago after a patient escaped, so there was only one way in or out. I stood at the threshold for maybe 5 minutes, calling Jimmy's name into the void, but all I heard was the rain hammering against the roof and this weird metallic creaking sound, like pipes expanding and contracting. Saturday crawled by in a haze of emergency protocols and barely controlled chaos. Without proper lighting, half the patients refused to leave their rooms, and the ones who did wandered the dim hallways like ghosts, bumping into walls and crying. We had 2 medical emergencies that nearly turned fatal because we couldn't find supplies fast enough in the dark storage rooms. I kept asking Carl when we could check on the isolation wing, but he brushed me off every time. "Those rooms are soundproof," he'd say. "Even if they're yelling, we wouldn't hear them. They're safer in there than out here with all this confusion." But I noticed he never went near that corridor himself, always found reasons to be on the opposite side of the building. The generators sputtered and coughed all day, threatening to die completely several times. Judith showed me the isolation log from the night shift. The last entry for room 9 was my signature from when we'd admitted Jimmy at 7:47 p.m. Friday. No one had been back since. "It's protocol during power emergencies," she explained, but her voice had this uncertain edge. "We maintain minimum contact to preserve resources." Sunday morning, the power finally came back on at 6:14 a.m. I was in the break room when the fluorescent lights buzzed to life, so bright after 2 days of shadows that everyone had to shield their eyes. Immediately, I headed for the isolation wing, but Carl intercepted me in the main hallway. "We'll do rounds together," he said, but something in his expression had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by this tight nervousness around his mouth. The isolation corridor looked different in the full light. Water had leaked through the ceiling tiles during the storm, creating these dark brown stains that spread across the floor in weird patterns. The air smelled wrong too, metallic and sweet at the same time, like copper pennies mixed with rotting fruit. When we got to room 9, Carl fumbled with his keys, dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. "Jimmy?" he called out before opening it. No response. The door swung inward, and I saw Carl's whole body go rigid. He blocked the doorway with his arm when I tried to look inside. "Get Donovan," he said, his voice barely steady, "and call the state police. Don't let anyone else near this wing." Through the gap under Carl's arm, I caught a glimpse of the room that still visits me in nightmares 40 years later. Jimmy was in the corner, curled into himself, completely still. The padding on the walls, that yellowed foam I'd noticed Friday night, had been torn apart in long vertical strips, like something with claws had raked down them over and over. But it was the bruises that made my throat close up. Purple-black marks covered every visible inch of Jimmy's skin, perfect oval shapes like fingerprints, but the spacing was all wrong, too wide to be from normal hands. His own fingernails were torn and bloody, some completely missing, and there were deep scratches across his face and neck that formed patterns, almost like symbols or letters I couldn't read. The overhead light, the one in the metal cage he'd stared at so intently, was shattered. Glass shards covered the floor, each piece reflecting the harsh fluorescent light from the hallway. On the wall opposite the door, drawn in what looked like blood, were numbers: 7, 14, 21, 23, 23, 23. Repeated over and over until they covered the entire surface. But the thing that haunts me most was the position of his body, pressed into that corner like he was trying to push himself through the wall to escape something we couldn't see. The state police arrived within an hour, followed by investigators from the Department of Health. They sealed off the entire isolation wing, took photographs from every angle, measured the bruises, the scratches, documented every number on the wall. The detective in charge, a woman with prematurely gray hair named Detective Reeves, interviewed me for 3 hours straight. She kept coming back to the timeline. When exactly had the lights gone out? Who had made the decision not to check the isolation rooms? Why had it taken 48 hours before anyone entered room 9? I told her about the power outage, about Donovan's orders, about Carl refusing to let anyone near the wing. She wrote everything down in this small spiral notebook, occasionally stopping to examine photos they'd taken of Jimmy's injuries. "These bruise patterns," she said at one point, showing me a close-up image that made my stomach turn. The medical examiner says they're consistent with restraint marks, but the positioning doesn't make sense. They're on parts of his body he couldn't have reached himself, and they're too uniform to be from a struggle. She paused, tapping her pen against the notebook. And there's no evidence anyone else entered that room after you and Carl locked him in Friday night. What they found when they investigated further was somehow worse than the scene itself. The security logs, which ran on battery backup, showed that the door to room 9 had never been opened between Friday evening and Sunday morning. The electronic lock registered my keycard at 7:47 p.m. Friday, and then Carl's at 6:31 a.m. Sunday, with nothing in between. But the cameras, the ones that should have been recording the hallway outside the isolation wing, had been deliberately disabled. Not by the power outage. Someone had cut the cables inside the security office Thursday night, before Jimmy was even put in isolation. The maintenance logs showed something else strange. A work order from 2 weeks earlier to inspect the electrical system in room 9, specifically the overhead light fixture. The work was signed off as completed by a maintenance worker named Paul Garrett, but when they tried to find him, HR discovered he'd quit suddenly the day after finishing the job, left no forwarding address, cleared out his on-site apartment in the middle of the night. His employment file had a note from Judith about concerning behavior and inappropriate interest in patient histories, but no one had followed up on it. The investigation went on for weeks, but they never found Paul Garrett. What they did find, hidden in the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the isolation wing, made everyone involved wish they hadn't looked. There was a makeshift living space down there. A mattress, canned goods, bottles of water, and hundreds of photographs tacked to the pipes. Pictures of patients in the isolation rooms, taken through tiny holes that had been drilled through the floors. Some photos went back years, showing patients who'd been discharged or transferred long ago. But there were also journals, dozens of them, filled with observations about the patients, their behaviors, their fears. Jimmy's name appeared frequently in the most recent entries. Garrett had been watching him for months, documenting his number sequences, his mentions of his dead sister. The final entry, dated the day after Garrett supposedly quit, just said, "Room 9 is prepared. The connection is complete. He'll understand when the lights go out." The police theorized that Garrett had rigged something in the electrical system, maybe some kind of remote access to the room, but they never found evidence of how he could have gotten in and out without the door opening. Jimmy survived, if you can call it that. He never spoke again, never made eye contact with anyone, just sat in the corner of whatever room they put him in, drawing numbers on his palms with his finger. Always that same sequence, 7, 14, 21, 23. They transferred him to a state facility in New Jersey, and I heard later that he died there in 1987, cardiac arrest in his sleep. The official investigation concluded that he'd suffered a severe psychotic break during the isolation, exacerbated by the darkness and the storm, and had somehow inflicted all those injuries on himself, despite the physical impossibility of it. Pinewood Behavioral Center closed 6 months after the incident. Not because of Jimmy. Officially, it was due to budget cuts and failing infrastructure, but those of us who worked there knew the truth. After what happened in room 9, none of the staff would go near the isolation wing. Patients started refusing treatment. Families pulled their relatives out. The place just died. They demolished the building in 1984, but before they did, I went back one last time. The isolation wing door was chained shut, but through a gap I could see down that hallway. On the floor, barely visible in the dust and debris, were footprints leading to and from room 9. Fresh footprints, even though the building had been empty for over a year. I never went back after that, never tried to find out more. Some questions don't need answers. Some doors should stay locked. I never thought I'd step inside Westridge Psychiatric again, at least not as a patient. Years ago, I worked there as a night nurse. 12-hour shifts filled with screams, sudden code calls, and the strange calm that came just before dawn. After a rough divorce and a spiral that left me barely functioning, I signed myself in. It was humiliating, walking through those same sliding doors with a wristband instead of a key card, seeing familiar corridors through the eyes of someone on the other side. The fluorescent light still buzzed, same sterile hum, same faint smell of antiseptic and burned coffee. The first few nights were ordinary, or as ordinary as they can be in a place like that. My room was on the east wing, quiet, except for the constant murmur of the air vents. I told myself it was the HVAC system, the same one I'd heard hundreds of times during shifts. But one night, lying awake around 3 a.m., I realized the sound wasn't steady. It rose and fell, like a voice struggling to form words. I pressed my ear closer to the vent above my bed, and for a moment I could swear I heard someone crying, soft, broken sobs fading in and out of the metallic echo. The next morning I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was another patient crying somewhere down the hall, the sound bouncing through the ducts. Still, it lingered in my head all day. That rhythm, that desperation. Later, while I sat in the common area coloring to keep my hands busy, I caught another sound coming from the vent above the TV, a man whispering something I couldn't quite make out. The other patients didn't seem to notice. When I asked one of the orderlies about it, he gave me a blank stare and said the vents hadn't worked in years. Central system's been dead since the fire, he added, walking off like it was nothing. That night, I moved my mattress closer to the wall under the vent. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't slipping back into the same hallucinations that had landed me there. I waited in the dark, eyes on the faint green glow of the exit sign. Around the same hour, the whispering began again, clearer this time. A woman's voice trembling, pleading for someone named Dr. Lang. Then a deeper voice snapped back, harsh, commanding. I knew that tone. It was the same one I'd heard from the old head psychiatrist years ago during emergency evaluations. Except, Dr. Lang had died almost 20 years earlier. By the fifth night, sleep had become impossible. Every time the building went still, the vents filled with voices, sometimes sobbing, sometimes laughter, sometimes long stretches of silence broken by sudden bursts of shouting. It wasn't random noise. It sounded like entire conversations cut into fragments. I started recognizing certain tones, the way someone gasped or hesitated, as if these were real people trapped in a loop. I tried recording it with the small tape player they gave me for therapy notes, but every playback was blank, just static, and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I reported it to the staff the following morning, expecting someone to at least check the ducts. Instead, they called the attending psychiatrist, Dr. Hillman, who smiled too easily and told me I was projecting unresolved trauma. Within an hour, they adjusted my medication and moved me to another wing, the one furthest from the East Hall. The walls there were thicker, newer, painted pale green instead of the faded beige I knew. For a while it worked. No whispers, no crying, just the low rattle of the heating system. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It felt staged, like a recording had simply been paused. One afternoon, during occupational therapy, a maintenance worker came by to fix a flickering light. I asked him if he'd ever heard voices through the vents in the old wing. He laughed softly and said, "Lady, those vents haven't carried air since before I started here." I pressed him for more, and his face changed. His eyes dropped to the floor. "There used to be a tape system for observation," he said, almost whispering. "Back when they recorded patient sessions, they fed the wires through the same ducts, but that was before they sealed them." Then he realized he'd said too much and packed his tools faster than I could ask anything else. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew where the old observation room was, behind the locked storage area near the east exit. I waited until lights out, then slipped out with a flashlight I'd hidden in my pillowcase. The hall was dead quiet except for the distant creak of pipes cooling. When I reached the old door, I noticed the padlock was new, shiny compared to the corroded hinges. I hesitated for a long time before pushing the light through a small gap near the handle. The beam landed on a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting on a metal shelf, coated in dust, but still plugged in. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, listening to the low hum of something alive behind that door. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement inside, like the reflection of someone pacing slowly. But when I leaned closer, the sound returned. The same woman's voice I'd heard through the vents, pleading again for Dr. Lang. It wasn't coming from the room itself, but from deep within the wall, traveling through metal and plaster. The air felt charged, like a storm was building somewhere underground. I went to the nurse's station, trying to explain what I'd found, but before I could finish, they called for security. The orderlies led me back to my room, injected something clear into my IV, and told me to rest. I remember drifting in and out, the ceiling above me bending slightly each time I blinked. Somewhere between sleep and waking, I heard the same whispering start again, but this time the voices said my name. They spoke softly, almost kindly, as if welcoming me back. When I woke up, I was in a different room, smaller, windowless, walls painted white. Dr. Hillman told me I'd had an episode, and that I'd be discharged soon if I cooperated, but something about his tone felt rehearsed, the way he avoided eye contact when I asked about the East Wing. A few days later, during my final evaluation, a young intern accidentally handed me the wrong folder. It contained maintenance logs from the old ventilation system. The last entry dated 15 years before I was ever hired. The note beside it read, "Vent ducts permanently sealed after audio monitoring discontinued. Tapes archived in storage C." I was released a week later. I tried to put it behind me, to tell myself it was all part of the breakdown, a mind trying to make sense of static. But every now and then when the house is quiet and the air conditioner kicks in, I swear I can still catch it. Faint, somewhere in the hiss of the vents. A voice, soft and cracked, repeating my name the way it did that night. It always stops after the same 3 words, "We hear you." The hospital cafeteria smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables most days. I'd been working there for 3 months, doing whatever needed to be done, cleaning trays, changing linens, helping nurses move patients who were too weak to stand. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough for rent and gas, and in a town like ours, that counted as stability. The place was old, built in the 1950s, with peeling paint that no one ever bothered to fix because the funding's coming next quarter. Everyone said that every quarter. My shift usually started at noon, but the supervisor liked to shuffle schedules without notice. That's how I ended up in the nutrition ward one afternoon. The hallway there was quieter than anywhere else, lined with faded murals of fruits and smiling kids that looked more like ghosts than encouragement. The staff said it was part of a dietary research program, but the kids inside barely spoke, and the ones who did sounded too tired to finish sentences. There was one girl who caught my attention almost immediately. Her name was Emily. She couldn't have been more than 11, with hair so light it looked white under the fluorescent lights. Her chart said she was on a restricted protein intake trial. She'd always greet me when I brought in her tray, even if it was just boiled rice or some flavorless broth. Her voice was soft, like she was saving every word for when it really mattered. I started timing my cleaning rounds to match her meal times, just so I could talk to her a little. Over the next couple of weeks, Emily got thinner. Her wrists looked fragile, like the hospital band alone could bruise her. I mentioned it once to a nurse named Dana, who told me not to worry. The doctors are monitoring everything. But the doctors never came around when I was there. The only people I saw were interns with clipboards, and these black binders they never let out of their sight. Every note they took felt rehearsed, like they already knew the answers before asking any questions. One day, I walked into the ward and her bed was empty. The sheets were folded, the pillow perfectly centered, and her chart was gone from the wall slot. I assumed she'd been moved to another unit, but when I asked around, the answers didn't make sense. Dana said she'd been transferred for observation, yet nobody could tell me to which floor. When I checked the patient log, her name wasn't there at all. It was as if Emily had never been admitted. That night, I stayed past my shift under the excuse of restocking supplies. Around 2 a.m., the hall lights dimmed to half brightness, and the whole floor turned unnervingly still. I crept toward the office the interns used, the one with the frosted glass window. Inside, I could hear muffled voices, 2 men and a woman, discussing reclassification and non-compliance. Then someone mentioned the girl who failed the intake protocol. I didn't need a name to know who they were talking about. When the door opened, I ducked into the storage room across the hall. They wheeled out a stretcher covered in a thin white sheet, and the shape beneath it was far too small to be an adult. I caught a glimpse of a pale wrist with the hospital band still on. I couldn't see the name, but I recognized the faded blue ink stain near the edge. Emily had accidentally marked it with her pen one day when she drew a little flower for me on her napkin. My throat went dry. They were taking her through the back corridor that led straight to the basement. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went straight to records. The clerk, a guy named Ellis who'd been there for decades, told me the nutrition ward files were restricted by administration. I asked why a child's file would be classified like that. He leaned closer and said quietly, "Those kids aren't admitted under pediatrics. They're under research subjects." That word, subjects, hit harder than anything else he could have said. That afternoon, I went back to the ward pretending to deliver linens. The air there felt heavier, and I noticed one of the doors, Emily's old room, had been repainted a shade darker than the rest. On the table inside, there was a new tray of untouched food and a different name tag. But the smell lingered, the same faint antiseptic mixed with something sour, like spoiled formula. I couldn't stay long before one of the interns spotted me and told me that area was off limits until further notice. Her tone was polite, but her eyes said, "Get out now." A few days later, the hospital released an internal memo saying a child from the nutrition ward had died of complications due to malnutrition. The note didn't mention her by name. The next morning, the trial banners outside were gone, replaced by posters about community wellness programs. I overheard staff whispering that the diet research wasn't officially approved by the ethics board. The funding had come from a private sponsor whose name nobody seemed to know. Everyone acted like nothing had happened, but the ward stayed half empty after that. I tried filing a report through the patient advocacy office, but they told me my account didn't align with official documentation. I asked if I could at least talk to the attending physician listed on her case, and the clerk said the doctor had resigned the same week the memo went out. When I pressed for more information, they threatened to terminate my position for violating confidentiality protocols. That's when I realized they weren't trying to hide a mistake. They were covering up a pattern. I quit 2 weeks later. Before leaving, I found one of Emily's drawings tucked under a stack of diet logs. Just a tiny flower sketched in blue ink. I kept it folded in my wallet for years. Every now and then I still check the news, hoping someone will uncover what really happened in that ward. But there's never been a single article, not even a mention. Maybe that's the most disturbing part, how something so cruel can happen right in front of everyone and still vanish without a trace.